And we're live this morning here at the Senate Armed Services Committee for a hearing on Middle East policy. We'll be getting testimony from former CIA Director and retired General David Petraeus, expected to answer questions on U.S. policy in the Middle East and also plans for combating ISIS. The chair of the committee, still waiting on him, John McCain of Arizona. This is live coverage right here on C-SPAN 3. And again, a full hearing of the committee this morning, the Senate Armed Services Committee, looking at Middle East policy and testimony from former CIA Director and retired General David Petraeus, retired general sentenced earlier this year to 2 years of probation and $100,000 fine for sharing classified information. He'll be talking about U.S. policy in the Middle East and plans for combating ISIS.
Committee will come to order. Since a quorum is now present, I ask the committee to consider a list of 3,725 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee the required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably record?
So moved.
All are second.
Second.
All in favor, say aye. The motion carries. Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on U.S. strategy in the Middle East. 8 years ago, our nation was losing a war in Iraq. Despite the assurances of the Bush administration, the generals and leaders there, despite the favorable comments of, at that time, Secretary of Defense, who said, quote, "stuff happens," and other equally ridiculous comments, we were losing the conflict. In fact, we were at a point where there was almost sufficient votes in the United States Senate to force a complete withdrawal from Iraq. And then a seminal event took place before this committee, a day that I will never forget. On September 11th, 2007, General David Petraeus appeared before this committee with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Their compelling testimony was critical in securing support for the surge, an integrated civil-military campaign plan that defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq, brought security to the Iraqi people, and created the possibility for meaningful political reconciliation. Now we meet again. Now we meet again. At a time of grave security challenges around the world, more than ever, our nation must be able to draw upon the wisdom and experience of its most distinguished leaders. That's why I'm so pleased to welcome back before this committee, who has had many appearances before this committee, one of our most distinguished leaders. I'm welcoming back General David Petraeus for his first appearance before Congress since leaving government. General, it's good to see you. I want to thank you on behalf of this committee for your willingness to testify today and offer insights from your decades of distinguished service, especially your leadership in Iraq, Afghanistan, and as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Across the Middle East today, the old order is collapsing, both the regional balance among states and social order within states. No new vision has emerged to take its place, and across the region, chaos fills the vast ungoverned spaces left behind. Filling this vacuum have been terrorist groups such as ISIL and al-Qaeda on the one hand, and hostile states such as Iran and now Russia on the other. This regional disintegration has only been made worse by a failure of U.S. strategy and leadership to shape events in this vital part of the world for the better. Too often we have confused our friends, encouraged our enemies, mistaken an excess of caution for prudence, and replace the risks of action with the perils of inaction. In Iraq and Syria, 1 year after the President commenced airstrikes and committed U.S. troops, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Commander of Central Command have characterized the fight against ISIL as a stalemate. ISIL has consolidated control of its core territories and expanded its control in Syria. Efforts to retake Iraqi cities like Mosul, Fallujah, and Ramadi have foundered. ISIL is expanding globally to places like Afghanistan, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, and Egypt. This appearance of success only enhances ISIL's ability to radicalize, recruit, and grow. The Obama administration now tells us their strategy is working. Ultimately, ISIL is not 10 feet tall. It can and must be defeated. However, the current policy does not appear sufficient to achieve our goal of degrading and destroying ISIL. To put it mildly, this committee's hearing last week on counter-ISIL strategy did little to alleviate these concerns. In the absence of an effective strategy, violent extremist groups like ISIL, al-Qaeda, and their adherents are expanding across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, including Afghanistan. After 14 years of fighting in Afghanistan, decisions made in the months ahead will determine whether our sacrifices were worth it. After pulling out of Iraq against the advice of our military leaders, the President's plan to withdraw from Afghanistan would risk a replay of that failure. We look forward to your views on this policy. In addition to the so-called Islamic State, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been another main beneficiary of the Middle East descent into chaos. For years, many of us have urged the administration to adopt a regional strategy to counter Iran's malign activities in the Middle East. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Instead, the administration has too often treated Iran as merely an arms control challenge rather than the wider geopolitical challenge that it is. Left unchecked, Iran has stepped up its destabilizing activities in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain, Gaza, and elsewhere. Whatever one thinks of the nuclear agreement, it will not resolve this larger Iran challenge and will likely make it worse as Iran gains new legitimacy, the lifting of sanctions, and billions of dollars in sanctions relief. Into the wreckage of our Middle East policy has now stepped Vladimir Putin. As in Ukraine and elsewhere, he perceives the administration's inaction and caution as a weakness, and he is taking advantage. Putin's ongoing military buildup in Syria is the greatest expansion of Russian power in the Middle East in 4 decades, and it will allow Putin to prop up Assad, play kingmaker in any transition, undermine U.S. policy and operations, and ultimately prolong this horrific conflict. The main beneficiary will be ISIL. In classic fashion, the administration first condemned Putin's move, but has now capitulated, agreeing to military talks. The first step toward a solution is recognizing there's a problem. Unfortunately, that has appeared beyond the capacity of the administration. Instead, they continue to resort to a litany of truisms, straw man arguments, partisan attacks, and talking points that, to borrow a phrase, require, quote, a willing suspension of disbelief. In a display of self-delusion that can rival the Bush administration's Iraq policy at its worst, the Obama administration now tells us their strategy is working, that we're making progress, that time is on our side, that strategic patience is all we need, and that we should just stay the course. When our earlier strategy in Iraq and the broader Middle East was failing, not so long ago, we thankfully had leaders like our distinguished witness who were willing to face that situation with realism, and a president who, to his everlasting credit, took responsibility for that failure and changed course. Other American presidents, including Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, have demonstrated a similar capacity for change. There's no reason President Obama could not do the same. No one believes that there are good options. There never are. No one believes that these kinds of problems lend themselves to purely military solutions. They never have and never will. No one expects us to succeed overnight, and no one believes that America can or should solve every problem by itself. But that does not absolve us of our responsibility to make the situation better where we can. Yes, these problems are hard, but as our witness once said, they're not hopeless. Now more than ever, we need some reasons to be hopeful again. I thank you for appearing before the committee today and look forward to your testimony. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And General Petraeus, welcome back to the Armed Services Committee. This morning's hearing continues the committee's review of the policy issues confronting the United States in the Middle East. And your long experience in a number of leadership positions, both in the United States military and as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, makes you superbly prepared and qualified to provide your perspective on the current situation in the Middle East. And once again, thank you for being here. The situation in the Middle East presents a deeply complex problem set, and it is a near certainty that the problems that were there challenge our nation's security today and for many years to come. And while our nation's military is playing a critical role in addressing the threats emanating from the Middle East, and lasting solutions will require, in addition, dogged diplomacy and persistent attention by our nation's civilian and military leaders and those of our allies and partners who share security interests in the region. As the committee heard at last week's hearing, the immediate threat confronting the United States, our partners and allies in the Middle East, is ISIL. ISIL's control over portions of Syria and Iraq provides this violent extremist organization a base from which to terrorize civilians and spread its poisonous ideology regionally and globally. The brutality of ISIL, coupled with that of the Assad regime and other armed elements in Iraq and Syria, has caused a collapse of stability in many areas and forced millions to flee the wanton violence. The emerging refugee crisis in Europe highlights the urgent need for the international community to focus on restoring security in the region. The U.S.-led international coalition, enabled by the leadership of retired General John Allen, has brought together 60-plus countries to respond to the ISIL threat including a multinational air campaign to degrade ISIL's capabilities and programs to train and equip local forces in Iraq and Syria. General Petraeus, we are very interested in your views on the value of a multilateral approach to confronting ISIL. I would also be interested to hear whether you support the efforts to build and work through local forces on the ground to liberate and then restore stability to areas previously under ISIL control. In Iraq, U.S. and partner nations are once again training and equipping the Iraqi security forces and helping to recruit Sunni tribal forces to the counter-ISIL effort. General Petraeus, given your experience on the ground in Iraq, which is extensive and detailed, both as an operational and strategic level commander, I look forward to hearing your assessment of the broader military campaign, but also on whether the Iraqi security forces can summon the will to fight successfully against ISIL and other opponents within Iraq. Further, the administration has rightly, I believe, conditioned our support to the Iraqi government on their continuing efforts to be more inclusive and responsive to the concerns of the Sunnis, Kurds, moderate Shias, and minorities. Again, your assessment of these political efforts would be deeply appreciated. In Syria, according to public reports, the DoD-run Train and Equip program has experienced a variety of setbacks. Many observers have criticized this program, and again, I would be interested in your assessment of the viability of this program. At the same time, the already difficult task of restoring security in Syria has only been further complicated by Russian President Putin's recent provocative act of deploying Russian Marines and equipment, including fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missiles to Assad regime-controlled areas under the guise of joining the counter-ISIL effort. What President Putin hopes to gain from this brazen military intervention in this volatile situation is unclear, and would again like your perspective on that issue. The other major issue for the United States and the Middle East is Iran. Last week, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, entered the implementation phase. In the coming months, the Iranians have much work to do, and the world will be watching to see whether Iran will discharge its obligations. Holding Iran accountable during this phase of the agreement is, I would suggest, one of the most significant efforts that we can take along with our allies. Aside from the JCPOA, General Petraeus, Iran's malign and destabilizing activities are of critical concern. This includes the continued support and financing of the Assad regime, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia elements in Bahrain, and Shia militias in Iraq. Countering Iran's malign influence is an area where the administration has made a significant commitment to our partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council, among them an increase in training and exercise programs to ensure these partners have the necessary capabilities to counter Iranian threats. Again, your assessment of these efforts would be appreciated. While much attention is focused on the Middle East, the United States continues to have nearly 10,000 U.S. forces deployed in Afghanistan as part of the Resolute Support Mission. A critical decision will have to be made in the next few months regarding the size of U.S. forces to be retained in Afghanistan during 2016 and beyond. Again, your advice in this respect would also be appreciated. And lastly, we cannot forget that al-Qaeda, especially its affiliates in Yemen and adherents in Syria, remain a trans-regional threat to the United States and other interests around the world. Your insights with respect to what must be done to keep the pressure on al-Qaeda, both their senior leadership and their organizational structure, would be deeply appreciated. Once again, thank you for your service, your distinguished service, and thank you for joining us today.
General Petraeus, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back. Mr. Chairman, Senator Reid, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the situation in the Middle East. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, this is the first time I have testified in open session before Congress since resigning as director of the CIA nearly 3 years ago. As such, I think it is appropriate to begin my remarks this morning with an apology, one that I have offered before, but nonetheless one that I want to repeat to you and to the American public. 4 years ago, I made a serious mistake, one that brought discredit on me and pain closest to those closest to me. It was a violation of the trust placed in me and a breach of the values to which I'd been committed throughout my life. There's nothing I can do to undo what I did. I can only say again how sorry I am to those I let down, and then strive to go forward with a greater sense of humility and purpose, and with gratitude to those who stood with me during a very difficult chapter in my life. In light of all that, it means a great deal that you have asked me to share my views on the challenges in the Middle East, where, as you noted, I spent most of my last decade in government. I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for the support and friendship that you have long extended to me. The Middle East today is experiencing revolutionary upheaval that is unparalleled in its modern history. At the root of this upheaval is the weakening or disintegration of state authority in multiple countries. This has led to a violent struggle for power across a vast swath of territory, a competition both between different groups within states and one between different states in the region and some outside it. Almost every Middle Eastern country is now a battleground or a combatant in one or more wars. The principal winners thus far have been the most ruthless, revolutionary, and anti-American elements in the region. This includes Sunni extremists like the so-called Islamic State, which is attempting to carve a totalitarian caliphate out of the wreckage of the old order, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, which hopes to establish a kind of regional hegemony. All of the revolutionary forces, whether Sunni or Shiite, are exploiting the upheaval in the Middle East while also exacerbating it. While hostile to each other, the growth of each is feeding the sectarian radicalization that is fueling the other. But none of them reflects the hopes of the overwhelming majority of Middle Easterners. The crises of the Middle East pose a threat not just to regional stability, but also to global stability and to vital national interests of the United States. For the repercussions of developments in the Middle East extend well beyond it. Indeed, the Middle East is not a part of the world that plays by Las Vegas rules. What happens in the Middle East is not going to stay in the Middle East. We see this in the global reach of the Islamic State from the sanctuaries it has seized in the region, in the tsunami of refugees fleeing the conflicts of the Middle East, in the danger of a nuclear cascade sparked by Iranian actions, and in the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Russia over Syria. And it is in the Middle East today where the rules-based international order, the foundation of American security and prosperity since the end of World War II, is most in danger of coming apart at the seams. International peace and security do not require the United States to solve every crisis or to intervene in every conflict. But if America is ineffective or absent in the face of the most egregious violations of the most basic principles of the international order that we have championed, our commitment to that order is inevitably questioned and further challenges to it are invited. I will focus here this morning on three countries at the eye of the present geopolitical storm: Iraq, Syria, and Iran. It has been more than a year since the United States commenced military action against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And while there have been significant accomplishments, the progress achieved thus far has been inadequate. An impressive coalition has been established. Key ISIS leaders have been killed or captured, and support for local forces in Iraq and Syria has helped roll back ISIS in certain areas. Some elements of the right strategy are in place, but several are under-resourced while others are missing. We are not where we should be at this point. In Iraq, we have halted and reversed ISIS's momentum in some areas, but we have seen gains by ISIS in others, such as Ramadi. In my judgment, increased support for the Iraqi security forces, Sunni tribal forces, and Kurdish Peshmerga is needed, including embedding U.S. advisor elements down to the brigade headquarters level of those Iraqi forces fighting ISIS. I also believe that we should explore use of joint tactical air controllers with select Iraqi units to coordinate coalition airstrikes for those units. And we should examine whether our rules of engagement for precision strikes are too restrictive. That said, we should exercise restraint to ensure our forces do not take over Iraqi units. I would not, for example, embed U.S. personnel at the Iraqi battalion level, nor would I support clearance operations before a viable hold force is available. As critical as the frontline fight against ISIS is, however, the center of gravity for the sustainable defeat of ISIS in Iraq lies in Baghdad. In this respect, we should recall that the cause of Iraq's unraveling over the past several years was the corrupt, sectarian, and authoritarian behavior of former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and his government. This is what alienated the Sunni Arab population we worked so hard to get back into the fabric of Iraqi society during the surge. Maliki's actions in turn created the conditions for the Islamic State to reconstitute itself in Iraq, after which it gained additional strength in the Syrian civil war and then, of course, swept back into Iraq. The key now is for the United States to help strengthen those in Baghdad who are prepared to pursue inclusive politics and better governance, goals that unite the majority of Iraq's Shiites, Sunni, and Kurds. It is vital that Sunni and Kurds in particular are again given a stake in the success of the new Iraq rather than a stake in its failure. There is at present in Iraq an unprecedented opportunity to support Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, who, with the backing of Iraqi citizens in the streets, Iraq's senior Shia cleric, and one Shia party, is embarked on very serious reforms that are being resisted by the leaders of the major Iranian-supported militias and former Prime Minister Maliki. The reality, then, is that the challenges in Iraq are neither purely political nor purely military. They are both. What is required, therefore, is an integrated civil-military plan in which diplomatic and military lines of effort are coordinated to reinforce each other. That is what Ambassador Crocker and I pursued during the surge, and all the elements of that effort are once again required, though it is the Iraqis who must provide the ground forces and achieve reconciliation if the results are to be sustainable. Unfortunately, we do not yet have the proper civil-military architecture in place to support this, though we do appear to be moving closer to it. Notably, the operational headquarters for the military campaign against ISIS in Iraq is based in Kuwait. This means that the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad does not always have a day-to-day military counterpart. I would strongly recommend facilitating this by moving key elements of the headquarters to Baghdad and ensuring that a comprehensive civil-military plan is pursued. I note here that I'm very encouraged that the general selected to lead the campaign in Iraq is the officer who, as a brigade commander in Ramadi in the fall of 2006, launched the reconciliation initiative on which we subsequently built during the surge, leading eventually to what became the Anbar Awakening. I should also note that, in my view, the commander in Baghdad should focus primarily on Iraq, while another commander, perhaps positioned in Turkey, perhaps under the 3-star in Iraq, should be designated to focus on operations in Syria, which clearly need greater unity of effort. Let me now turn to the situation in Syria. Syria today, Mr. Chairman, is a geopolitical Chernobyl, spewing instability and extremism over the region and the rest of the world. Like a nuclear disaster, the fallout from the meltdown of Syria threatens to be with us for decades, and the longer it is permitted to continue, the more severe the damage will be. It is frequently said that there is no military solution to Syria or the other conflicts roiling the Middle East. This may be true, but it is also misleading. For in every case, if there is to be any hope of a political settlement, a certain military and security context is required, and that context will not materialize on its own. We and our partners need to facilitate it, and over the past 4 years, we have not done so. It has been clear from early on in Syria that the desired context requires the development of capable moderate Sunni Arab ground forces. Such Sunni elements are critical for any objective one might have in Syria: defeating extremists like ISIS, changing the momentum on the battlefield to enable a negotiated settlement, and upholding that agreement while keeping ISIS down. Unfortunately, we are no closer today to having that Sunni force than we were a year ago, or when support for such forces was first considered several years ago. The central problem in Syria is that Sunni Arabs will not be willing partners against the Islamic State unless we commit to protect them and the broader Syrian population against all enemies, not just ISIS. That means protecting them from the unrestricted warfare being waged against them by Bashar al-Assad, especially by his Air Force and its use of barrel bombs. This, not ISIS, has been the primary source of civilian casualties. It has also been a principal driver of the radicalization fueling ISIS and the refugee crisis. The problems in Syria cannot be quickly resolved, but there are actions the U.S. and only the U.S. can take that would make a difference. We could, for example, tell Assad that the use of barrel bombs must end, and that if they continue, we will stop the Syrian Air Force from flying. We have that capability. This would not end the humanitarian crisis in Syria, or end the broader war, or bring about the collapse of the Assad regime. But it would remove a particularly vicious weapon from Assad's arsenal. It would demonstrate that the United States is willing to stand against Assad. And it would show the Syrian people that we can do what the Islamic State cannot: provide them with a measure of protection. I would also support the establishment of enclaves in Syria protected by coalition air power, where a moderate Sunni force could be supported and where additional forces could be trained. Internally displaced persons could find refuge, and the Syrian opposition could organize. Now, no one is more conscious of the costs of military intervention or of the limits of our military power than I am. As commander in Iraq and then Afghanistan during the height of combat in those countries, I wrote more letters of condolence to parents of America's sons and daughters than any of my contemporaries. I do not make recommendations for any kind of military action lightly. But inaction can also carry profound risks and costs for our national security. We see that clearly today in Syria. And Russia's recent military escalation in Syria is a further reminder that when the U.S. does not take the initiative, others will fill the vacuum, often in ways that are harmful to our interests. Russia's actions to bolster Assad increase the imperative of support for the moderate opposition and Syrian civilians. We should not allow Russia to push us into coalition with Assad, which appears to be President Putin's intention. While we should not rush to oust Assad without an understanding of what will follow him, Assad cannot be part of the solution in Syria. He is, after all, the individual seen by Sunnis across the region as responsible for the deaths of some 250,000 Syrians, the displacement of well over a third of Syria's population, and the destruction of many of Syria's once thriving communities. Finally, let me turn to Iran. The nuclear agreement negotiated by the Obama administration contains many positive elements. It also contains problematic elements. Over the next 10 to 15 years, the agreement will impose meaningful constraints on Iran's nuclear activities. It will also, however, increase considerably the resources available for the Iranian regime to pursue malign activities. And in the longer term, as constraints imposed by the agreement expire, the risk of Iranian proliferation will increase. The key question going forward is what will be the relationship of the United States to Iranian power? Will we seek to counter it or to accommodate it? As the Obama administration sought to promote the nuclear agreement, its senior members pledged the former, to counter malign Iranian activity. But many in the region worry that the White House will now pursue the latter, attempting to work with Iran, perhaps beginning with Syria. This would be a mistake. To be sure, the idea of reconciliation with Iran should not be dismissed. But it is one thing if reconciliation means that Iran abandons its Quds Force-driven foreign policy, sponsorship of extremist proxies, and pursuit of hegemony over its neighbors. It is a very different matter if reconciliation entails accommodating those actions. As we have seen in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, Iran's activities are not only hostile to us and our partners, they also exacerbate Sunni feelings of alienation and disenfranchisement, which in turn drive sectarian radicalization and the growth of groups like ISIS. Thus, rather than viewing the nuclear agreement as marking the end of a hostile relationship with Iran that will enable our disengagement from the Middle East, we should see it as inaugurating a new, more complex phase of that competition that will require intensified U.S. involvement in the region. This should include several important actions. First, the United States should make absolutely clear that we will never allow Iran to possess highly enriched uranium, and that any move in that direction will be met with military force. This guarantee must be ironclad to reassure our partners in the region and have the desired effect with Iran. Such a declaration would carry maximal credibility if issued by the President and Congress together. Second, we must intensify our work with our Arab and Israeli partners to counter Iran's malign regional activities. This can take several forms, including continued use of existing sanctions authorities against Iranian entities tied to terrorism, ballistic missile development, and human rights abuses. It should also include expedited approval of weapons systems sought by our partners in the region and greater integration of their capabilities. And it should encompass additional actions to demonstrate that the theater remains set with respect to our capabilities to carry out military operations against Iran's nuclear program if necessary. Beyond these actions, we should understand that the most immediate test for the credibility of our policy will be what we do in Iraq and Syria. The outcome in those countries will be the basis for the judgments of friend and foe alike about our steadfastness and competence in thwarting ISIS, other extremists, and Iran's quest for hegemony. Mr. Chairman, the situation confronting the U.S. and the Middle East today is very hard. But as I observed, and as you recalled, when I took command in Iraq in early February 2007, amidst terrible sectarian violence, hard is not hopeless. As complex and challenging as the crises in the region are, I'm convinced the United States is capable of rising to the challenge if we choose to do so. I ended my statements before the Senate Armed Services Committee in the past by thanking its members for their steadfast support of our men and women in uniform. I will end my statement this morning the same way, repeating the gratitude that so many of us felt during the height of our engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan for the committee's extraordinary support for so many critical initiatives on and off the battlefield, even when a number of members questioned the policies we were executing. This committee has also long played a critical oversight role, posing tough questions about U.S. policy and strategy. I highlight the leadership of Chairman McCain in this regard for questioning the strategy in Iraq before 2007 and calling for many of the key elements that ultimately made possible the stabilization of that country. The questions that members of this committee ask about our approach in Syria and the broader fight against ISIS continue in this tradition. Again, this committee's unwavering support of those serving our nation in uniform has meant a tremendous amount to those on the battlefield and to those supporting them. And it is with those great Americans in mind that I have offered my thoughts here this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General, and thank you for probably the most comprehensive overview that this committee has received on this situation. I'm very grateful, and I would mention perhaps one of the most admirable and important part of my experience was watching your leadership, not only in the architect of the surge, but your motivation of the young men and women who are serving in the military as officers and enlisted. Your inspirational leadership to them was something which I will always remember with great admiration. You called for in your statement what some of us have been asking for years, and that is barrel bombs have got to end. It's not ISIS that's dropping the barrel bombs, and when my colleagues say ISIS is the problem, they're not the ones that have killed 230,000 of their countrymen. It's Bashar Assad, and we should own up to that. And some kind of accommodation with Bashar Assad, of course, would fly in the face of everything that the United States of America has ever stood for. So you are calling for in your statement that we tell Bashar Assad to stop the barrel bombs and establish an enclave where people could take refuge, could have protection from the incredible, insane cruelties of Bashar Assad. There's going to be blowback on that. Well, doesn't that mean that we're going to have American boots on the ground? Doesn't that mean we're back in the quagmire? Doesn't that mean I can see the reaction now from some of my friends, who, by the way, the same ones that opposed the surge when they're around. But what's your response to that, General Petraeus, that this would then cause us to be involved with boots on the ground and back into the quagmire that characterized our involvement prior to the surge?
Well, a couple of points, if I could, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I think very important to underscore the fact that Bashar al-Assad can't be part of the long-run solution in Syria. He is, as you noted, as I noted, the individual held responsible for well over 200,000, perhaps as high as 250,000 Syrians dead. And he is the magnetic attraction that is bringing jihadis to Syria to fight him. And indeed, if we are to support a force, it won't work for us. It won't be supportable if we don't support it against Bashar al-Assad's actions against it, the most horrific of which are the dropping of barrel bombs. And that can be stopped. We have the capability to do that. We don't have to put 165,000 troops on the ground to do that. We don't have to put any boots on the ground to do that, although I think at some point in an enclave, we should not be closed to the possibility of some advisors or support elements being in something like that in the same way that we have them on the ground in Iraq. So I don't see this as the entering a quagmire. I see this as taking out the most horrific casualty-producing item. I think General Allen has said that well over 50% of the casualties overall in Syria have been caused by these indiscriminate barrel bombs that can, at a moment's notice, drop from the sky. We have the capability to stop that, and we should.
Speaking of Russia, I noted that the Russians now have aircraft that are primarily as interceptors, not close air support. ISIS doesn't have an air force. It's very interesting. And what is your assessment of what Vladimir Putin is trying to accomplish with this incredible buildup in Syria, and what should the United States do in response?
Well, first of all, I think you have to look at this writ large. I think that what Vladimir Putin would like to do is resurrect the Russian Empire. You see this in a variety of different activities, or at least the Soviet Union. He has a number of different activities, diplomatic, economic, and, of course, military, in a variety of countries around Russia. And now he is, of course, in Syria as well, and trying to revive Russian relationships with countries in the Middle East. I think the immediate objective that he has in Syria is to solidify the corridor on the Mediterranean coast between Latakia, where he has his air base, and Tartus, where they have the Russian naval base, the only naval base left in the Mediterranean. Clearly, he would like to shore up his ally, Bashar al-Assad. At the very least, he wants to make sure that Bashar is not thrown under the bus by either other regime members or perhaps even Iran until at least he has some better sense of the way forward. His objective is to keep that naval base and indeed to keep the air base that is also useful for solidifying it and that corridor. I would think beyond that, he wants to help Bashar solidify his grip, which has been challenged increasingly in recent months by ISIS and then by other opposition forces as well, that runs from the coast to Homs and then down to Damascus, and so that he can at least keep a rump Syrian state. But again, as I said, Assad cannot be part of the long-run solution, but as I also said, we should not be quick to oust Assad until we have some sense of what will follow him.
So the United States, in the short term, should do what in regards to this, in response to this significant military buildup?
Well, the first is we should not go in league with this. We should not think that we can partner with Russia and Iran and Bashar al-Assad against ISIS. Again, if Russia wanted to fight ISIS, they could have joined the 60-plus member coalition that General Allen has so capably put together and helped drop bombs on ISIS. They have some capabilities that would be useful to that fight. So this is clearly not what they're up to. And we have to be very clear in our resolve to ensure that we deter action by Russia that would involve any of the forces we're supporting and certainly anything that we're doing in that region and show firmly, not provocatively, that we will not accept that. I might add that this also extends, of course, to what's going on in Ukraine. I was there a week or so ago. The good news is that the violence is down somewhat in the east, probably because Putin is going to the UN General Assembly, then has another negotiating round and would like to get out from underneath the sanctions that are so crippling. I might note that I think that Putin is not playing the strongest hand in the world, although he's playing his hand tactically quite effectively. But at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin is going to run out of foreign reserves. He's probably got 200 billion or so left. He will burn through those in the course of the next 2 years. And if the sanctions are still imposed at that time, he and the companies that have debt coming due, he running a very large fiscal deficit, are not going to be able to go to the world markets and get money to finance their government operations. So I think he has actually a limited window of a couple of years to continue provocative actions in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Syria, Georgia, and so forth. And we have to be very careful during this time when he could actually lash out and be even more dangerous than he has been.
Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, I think, for calling. It's a very important hearing, and General, thank you for your very incisive and extraordinarily erudite treatment of these complex issues. It's been very helpful. Just want to sort of go back to the point that you made. Long-term, Assad cannot be the future of Syria.
Correct.
But short-term, you acknowledge that there has to be some recognition of what the following on
Absolutely.
Will be.
Sure. I mean, Syria could actually get worse.
Right. Now,
and it's hard to believe that, but it could get worse.
Does that in some way imply that for at least the temporary expedient measure, we would have to work with Assad, with the Russians, et cetera, to create a transition? You know, you seem to pose this dilemma: is he can't go until we know it's following him, but he can't stay forever, but we don't know where to move.
Sure.
I think that's the key question.
I think actually being seen to work with Assad would unravel our relationships with our Sunni partners in the region, and I think it's therefore not something we can do. Having said that, what we can do is ensure that we don't launch an offensive or support an offensive by opposition forces that could precipitate his departure before, again, there is some sense of what will follow. As I mentioned, again, this Sunni Arab force that we need to support is essential not just to fight ISIS, it's essential to create the context within which you might actually get a political agreement, and that context is not there right now.
So essentially what your advice would be is that this Sunni opposition force, composed of a whole range of elements with different political philosophies, if it puts sufficient pressure on Assad, could force him to leave? Is that the solution?
Well, I don't know about force him to leave. Again, it could force a negotiated settlement, out of which I would think there will come something that will not include Assad.
Let me ask
again, I don't see how he's possibly part of the long run.
Let me ask again. I think you have, because of your insights, you have continually revealed the complexity of this issue. And if we could pursue it, who is going to do the negotiations if we're looking for a negotiated agreement?
Well, there is a UN Special Representative of the Secretary General. He happens to be the same individual, Staffan de Mistura, who was the SRSG in Iraq during the surge, as you'll recall. And candidly, I played a role in persuading him to do the same position in Afghanistan, where he was also highly capable. So there is an extant process. I actually am seeing him on Sunday in New York, just purely coincidentally.
So, you know, in a practical sense, we should begin to energize this UN process as an effective means to create at least a forum for negotiations.
Correct. Now, I mean, this does exist. It's been halting, to put a happy face on it, but it does exist, and it is something on which we could build. Again, as there is a sense of the context developing where those in Damascus are going to realize that perhaps it's time to cut a deal, and those who are supporting Damascus in Tehran and now in Moscow.
Let me, you early on were advocating a train and equip program for Syria to get effective counter at ISIL and at least counter ISIL forces on the ground. What can we do to revitalize that effort? Or is it possible to revitalize it, to be very?
I think it is. Frankly, again, it has to. If we cannot do this, we aren't going to defeat the Islamic State. We've done a great deal with the Syrian Kurds.
Yes.
But you can't push Kurds there or in Iraq farther than the areas that they can hold with legitimacy. So you can't push them all the way, I don't think, to take out the capital of the Islamic State, for example, and expect them to hold that. It's not their traditional territory. And the same is true in Iraq. Those who say, well, just keep pushing the Peshmerga further. The Peshmerga shouldn't go further. Masoud Barzani knows that. I have heard that. And there's recognition that that shouldn't go. So, again, in Iraq, there also has to be the development of this force, and that is moving along. I think, actually, the pieces are in place if we will resource them and actually make a critical policy decision. And I think that's the critical element for a Sunni force in Syria. They are not going to be willing to be supported by us if we're not going to support them when they're under attack by Bashar, as well as when they're under attack by ISIS. Or, by the way, for that matter, Jabhat al-Nusra or the Khorasan group or some others.
So you think that it's been a long and winding road, but it can be done, putting in the field indigenous forces, Syrian forces, et cetera, and the key policy decision is that they will be protected against any foe that are...
Indeed, and take down the barrel bombs. If the barrel bombs continue, then the Air Force goes down. Beyond that, I think we're going to have to support some forces that will not have gone all the way through our train and equip program. Again, I think pushing everybody through that is not necessarily the solution for ramping up.
If the chairman would indulge, one of the approaches to taking down the barrel bomb is eliminating the airfields, although some of these can be dropped by helicopters, so that makes it very difficult. But the other is to destroy the aircraft, et cetera. Is there any sort of, that runs the risk, obviously, of some response, if not by the Syrians, some response by even in the Russians, at least protesting?
Well, there's publicly reported that had we taken out the chemical systems in the Red Line issue, that a lot of that would have been done, if not all of it, by sea and air-launched cruise missiles and a variety of others, so you don't even have to fly in the airspace necessarily. The fact is we're already in Syrian airspace. We're flying over it all the time. We've already put boots on the ground in Syria, special mission unit boots. So we have the capability to do a great deal, and I think we know how to do it capably and without undue risk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Senator McCain when he said that it's refreshing to get a very succinct presentation, breaking it out, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and you have certainly done that, and I appreciate it very much. Sure. One thing we haven't talked about very much is the refugee situation, and it's been our feeling, or at least my feeling for a long time, that until such time as we develop a strategy in the Middle East, it's going to be very difficult to address this. It's also, as you pointed out, it can become more severe if we don't. In January, General Mattis testified before this group. He said, quote, "We have many potential allies around the world in the Middle East who have rallied to us, but we have not been clear about where we stand in defining or dealing with the growing violent jihadist terrorist threat." He's saying the same thing. We don't have a specific strategy there. Dr. Kissinger stated before this committee, "The role of the United States is indispensable. It's time for a global upheaval, and the consequences of American disengagement magnifies and requires larger intervention later." First of all, to ask if you agree with these assessments.
I do, yes.
You know, I'm embarrassed to say that if we have a strategy in the Middle East and dealing with specifically these countries and others, I don't know what it is, because we've been waiting for that strategy, and it seems to me that you're not going to resolve the refugee problem. It's a very real one. Here we are expanding the numbers that we would be willing to accept, and it's just a drop in the bucket when you look at 4 million that are out there, plus another 8 million that have been displaced are still in Syria. So until that time, I don't think it's going to resolve the problem. Would you have a specific explanation of the strategy of the administration in the Middle East, affecting the whole Middle East, along with the Syria, Iraq, and Iran? Do you know what that is?
I'll defer to the administration for that.
Well, I've been deferring to the administration of that also, and we still don't have it. You mentioned Ukraine. I know this is supposed to be the Middle East subject, but I happened to be there right after the Ukrainian elections with Poroshenko, with Yatsenyuk, the prime minister, and how proud they were and how committed they were to us. That they, for the first time in 96 years, don't have one communist in their parliament. And then immediately, of course, Putin started invading, sending troops in, sending equipment in, very similar to what's happening in Syria. Now, you did respond to what they're trying to, I guess, do with their military buildup in Syria. Is there anything you would like to add to that in terms of what their end game is, what they're trying to accomplish with that?
Let me go back to Ukraine, if I could, actually, because I think
Sure.
what Putin wants in Ukraine is to ensure that Ukraine does not succeed. His worst nightmare would be a thriving, vibrant, prosperous democracy with free market economy on his western border. He knows he can look at Poland and see what happened in the 20 years since Poland and Ukraine had roughly the same per capita GDP, Poland is twice as much now. Ukraine is still mired where they were. So he's going to do everything he can, not only now that the conflict seems to be freezing, to keep it bubbling, but what he really wants to do is, again, ensure that there is failure in Ukraine. And in that regard, the future of Ukraine is going to be determined in Kiev, not out in the Donbass. Yeah. There are concerns about political infighting and so forth. And the Ukrainian leaders have got to pull together and get the politics right, just the way, by the way, Iraqi leaders have got to pull together, because the center of gravity, as I mentioned, of the fight in Iraq is actually not on the front lines, as important as fighting on the front lines is and pushing back ISIS and out of Ramadi and out of Mosul and so forth. The future of Iraq is going to be determined by politics in Baghdad. And as I mentioned, we have a unique opportunity right now to support the Prime Minister of Baghdad, who is a year into the job pursuing very aggressive reforms. He's done away with the vice presidencies, the deputy prime ministers, 8 ministries, and is now asking for examination of the activities of the Chief Justice, somebody who was actually a solid, reasonable Chief Justice during the surge and a few years after that, but then increasingly became used, I think is an accurate description by Prime Minister Maliki, to go after the senior Sunni Arab politicians and to support other activities that ultimately alienated the Sunni population and undid what we achieved during the surge.
But General Petraeus, my time has expired, but here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to have you answer for the record. I go back to Oklahoma and I talk to people, and they contend, and I do too, that we're overcomplicating this deal that we have proposed with Iran, and that you don't really need to go beyond the fact that, as our Ronald Reagan used to say, verification is important. I don't think verification is there, so I'd like to have you analyze just that part of this proposed deal. If we have something that can go as long as 54 days before going in to find out whether or not Iran is developing some of the things that we think they are, I'd like to know how that is verification plays into this, if you do that for me.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you for your service. Characterize, if you would, on this solution that follows Assad. In order to get there, how could we interact with Russia in the UN context in order to bring about a political solution?
Well, first of all, I think it's just important to acknowledge that there are various potential options for Syria. One could be you could put the whole country back together again and have a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian, pluralist democracy. I find that probably remote in terms of possibilities, all the way to acknowledging that we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and there will be a number of states carved out of the old Syria, perhaps a Sunnistan, a Shia Alawitistan, and Kurdistan, perhaps more than one. But again, none of this is going to happen. You're not going to have negotiations, certainly unless the individual most responsible for this civil war, Bashar al-Assad, and his regime, feel that they are threatened and that their survival is in question. I think if you can get to that point, then you might have the leverage to conduct negotiations, in which case we would expect that Russia would be on the side of keeping a favorable regime to them, because, again, their overriding national interest in this case, beyond President Putin striding the world stage, again, as he did to provide the way out of the chemical weapons conundrum, is to maintain the seaport that he has at Tartus and the air base in that corridor that connects them on the Mediterranean coast.
In your opinion, are we not getting close to that point where Assad feels completely threatened?
I think probably the Russian intervention gives him a degree of new hope. I think he has been losing recently, gradually, steadily over the course of recent years, or a sense that he might not be able to continue the fight. But of course, progressively, what has happened over the years has been that first Quds Force advisors entered to help. Iran bankrolled and provided equipment and so forth. Russia's provided some of that. And then Lebanese Hezbollah entered the fray on the side of Syria as well. There are also reports of various Shia militias from neighboring countries fighting on his behalf, and certainly the support from Russia, especially if it includes a considerable amount of military hardware, will bolster him further.
Turning to Iran and the agreement, I read your op-ed with Ambassador Ross, and I find it very compelling. There are a lot of conclusions that the two of you drew that I had drawn as well in determining how I was going to vote. And that was that in the short term, it certainly is, in my judgment, and apparently what you articulated, in the interest of the United States with the agreement. But in the long term, and you speak in terms of 10, 15 years down the road, do you want to expand then on your idea, and I'll quote from your op-ed. In other words, deterrence is the key to ensuring not just that the Iranians live up to the agreement, but also to preventing them from developing nuclear weapons.
Absolutely, and not only that, deterring, if you will, or dissuading or persuading countries in the region that they don't need to go to that similar point that Iran is or will be at the 15-year mark and perhaps beyond, because then we're going to have a real threat to the proliferation regime that is in place, the non-proliferation regime. So again, the key element here is an ironclad U.S. position, again, ideally from both Congress and the White House, that states unequivocally that if Iran ever moves toward enriching to weapons grade, that we will stop that militarily.
And your other sentence that leapt out at me, but verification means only that we catch the Iranians if they cheat. What matters more is that the Iranians recognize that they will pay a meaningful price when we catch them.
Correct. Absolutely. Yep. Again, they've got to know in advance. And there are provisions in this. The snapback provision actually, I think, is fairly artful. Again, there are many positive features in this. The elimination of the entire 20% stockpile, elimination of 97, 98% of the low-enriched 3.5%, ends the plutonium path to a bomb, intrusive inspections with some wrinkles to be sure and some challenges that have been noted. But again, a number of positive, but some problematic ones, because along with that will come the release of at least $50 billion, according to the Undersecretary of the Treasury, that has been frozen around the world. And this is for a country that's 10% of its GDP just given to it. And while most of that undoubtedly will go to worthy programs for Iranian citizens, there will be a portion that will end up in the pockets of the Quds Force and enable them to further enable Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, who, when they couldn't get their way at the political table, got their way with force of arms and so forth, and Shia militia in Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. General Petraeus, thank you for your service to your country. It's been so valuable to us. Those who've watched your career, who've been with you in Iraq, seen you serve the country, I'm not aware of anyone who's done a superior job than you. And my respect for you and your integrity is unmatched. And Senator McCain, I believe his opening statement is very important for all of us. I think the questions Senator Reid has asked raise the kind of practical questions we've got to deal with. And I believe that at this point in time, we as a Congress needs to assert itself I think the first thing Congress should say to this administration is, show us a strategy that will lead us out of this morass that we're in. And we don't have that today. I believe, and I'll ask you, you've seen the political world and you see the disagreements and agreements that occur. Don't you think it's possible for the Republicans and Democrats on this panel and this Congress to agree on a long-term overall strategy for the Middle East that could guide us for decades to come, and isn't that important?
Well, what's interesting is that this is one of those moments in time where there seems to be a bipartisan sense of a need to do more, frankly, and that includes to define all the elements of a strategy. As I mentioned, some of those elements are there, some are under-resourced, and some are missing.
Well, if we had an overall goal, I think it would be important to have our allies also join in that. You think that's possible? Our European allies particularly could join with us on a plan that we could. It's got to extend beyond the next presidential election. We can't change our strategy every time a president changes.
Look, it's always good to recall Winston Churchill on allies, and he said the only thing worse than allies is not having any. And I spent a good bit of my time in Afghanistan in particular, but also in Iraq, doing what might be termed coalition maintenance. And I firmly believe that we should never go it alone if we can avoid doing that, although we should also recognize that there will be different contributions from different countries. And at the end of the day, there were virtually no countries in Afghanistan that did not have some caveat of some type. And the art of coalition command is figuring out what each country can uniquely do well, where each country needs to be augmented, frankly, by U.S. assets to enable it to do to contribute the most that it can, given the limitations that it has.
I think this is a historic hearing. I remember Senator McCain's reference to your testimony with Ambassador Crocker. I asked you at that time, and you've already answered it about the Middle East, I think, today, but you said, and we worried, could we be successful? And I ask you, do you believe if you go to Iraq with the surge that we can achieve a successful result? You said yes. I ask you, if you got to the point where that wasn't possible, would you tell us so? And you said yes. And you succeeded as you suggested that we could succeed. So I just can't tell you how much I value your opening statements, and I think we all should appreciate the efforts of Senator McCain at that time in 2007 when his presidential election. He placed everything he believed about the forces and our men and women in combat above any personal political goals. And I think that's a good example for all of us today.
I seem to recall him saying that he would rather lose an election than lose a war.
So I did both.
And he, if I could just make one quick comment, Senator, it's really important to remember that the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces. It was a surge of ideas. It was a change in strategy. Big ideas are everything, and shifting from consolidating on big bases and getting out of the neighborhoods to recognizing that the only way to secure the people is by living with them was big idea number one. It was very difficult to execute. It was costly, but it was necessary, and it actually did help bring security and ultimately brought violence down by some 90%, coupled with the other big idea, which was you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. You have to promote reconciliation. And that's why I singled out building on that case of reconciliation that had been established in late 2006 outside Ramadi by now Lieutenant General McFarland, who is actually back in that region and spending the bulk of his time in Baghdad.
Thank you for your service. Thank you for your wise words. And I think it's a challenge to us to see if we can't, at this point in history, develop an overall view of the Middle East. There's been studies that show the violence that have been around, where extremists extreme Islam tends to cause conflicts. And I think we need to see the whole region. And within it, we'll have allies, and we'll have problems, we'll have things we have to accept, even if we don't like. Some things we're going to have to try to provide leadership on. And a long-term agreement of that kind among both parties and all of our people, including our allies around the world, I believe would be a positive development. My hand is open to try to reach that kind of agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General, thank you again for your service, but also for being here today and presenting to us. I think it's most valuable. You know, we look at trying to find something that would resonate over in that part of the world, especially with Syria being so unstable right now and our relationships in that area. You can only look back at our past performance and find out, you know, and learn from that. So, you know, when Gaddafi was taken out of Libya and we had nothing to replace Gaddafi with, we see what's happened to Libya. We're gone out of there. In Iraq, when Maliki was put in, there had to be somebody making decisions on this was the person we're going to put in, knowing he had to be a hardline Shiite, knowing that he would divide up the Sunni Shiite forces there and cause basically the instability that we have. Was that not considered, or is it just impossible to find a moderate that can work with the different sectors involved?
First of all, there's been a lot of discussion of this and a lot looking back. Ambassador Jeffrey, who was the ambassador at the time, has written about this.
That's the caution that we have with Assad right now. Everyone's saying, who do you replace him with? What do you do? Since we've had failures in both of those.
Again, this is, you know, you play the partner you're dealt. You can influence that sometimes. There may have been a moment to do that. I actually ended up being in Afghanistan during the penultimate months of that, but I was there for the initial piece. We should remember that, you know, I've been tough on Prime Minister Maliki here, but Prime Minister Maliki during the surge and indeed in the years after the surge, he's the one who went after the Shia militia in Basra, very frankly impulsively, as you may recall, in the Charge of Knights in March. We called it March Madness in March of 2008. And it was a very close-run affair until we could get all of the forces marshaled to support his elements that were on the ground. And ultimately, it was a resounding victory there, in Sadr City, in Khatami, and a number of other places in Baghdad, and actually set the conditions for a period of relative stability and reasonable harmony that lasted for several years after that. Tragically, he undid much of what was done during the surge, no longer honored agreements that were made with the Sunni population, with the so-called Sons of Iraq, and so forth. And again, there has been a lot of academic and pundit discussion, think tank discussion on why we hung with him, especially because former Prime Minister Alawi got one more vote in the parliament, but then just couldn't form a government, and so there was a lot of wrangling back and forth. Without question, this is something that is in everyone's mind and in everyone's memory. And again, certainly the experience with Gaddafi, although I think at the point at which we committed to support the wellspring of citizens going after Gaddafi, that arguably was the right move. What needed to happen after that, of course, was to immediately, as quickly as possible, try to carry out a DDR program, a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program for all the different militias, try to help form security forces as quickly as possible. And I think that we have learned some lessons in that regard, so that when you've got an inclusive government, that it's supported wholeheartedly and you move forward.
I may, sir, I have
sure.
Time's limited here, but the Iran nuclear decision was probably the most difficult for all of us, not just in this committee, but I think in the whole Senate membership. With that being said, I had leaned strongly towards supporting because I wanted to work with our allies, and I always said if I couldn't go home and explain it, I couldn't vote for it, and I could not explain to West Virginians, basically, when they would ask the question, what happens at the end of 8.5 to 10 years, what happens at 15, because we put them in a position to be stronger if they had not changed their ways. And since we didn't hold them accountable, basically for their actions of terrorists, then how do you expect them to change their ways later on? So That was the one thing that stopped me from supporting it. What I would ask you is how damaging to our allies would the U.S. have been if it had been defeated, if we had not, those who voted for it had not voted for it? Would it have damaged our relationship since our allies were all saying, we're going to go without you?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. And I think there are big questions about what would happen to the sanctions regime. Could you get it back together? We'd kept Russia and China on board through this whole process. Does it all become unraveled and so forth? And look, I think the real question, this is a reality, focusing forward, taking the rearview mirrors off the bus. The biggest question is what happens after 15 years. That's when virtually all, there's a few that linger, but virtually all of the restrictions of the agreement end, and Iran can move out quite smartly in a variety of different areas in building its enrichment capacity and other elements of a program. And that's why it is so vitally important that the U.S. be very, very clear, crystal clear, ironclad, why the White House and Congress together should be very clear about what would happen if Iran ever made a move towards weapons-grade enrichment. That will also, again, not only hopefully deter Iran, but also reassure our Gulf allies, and that's another very important consideration.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
General Petraeus, thank you for your testimony. I think we could have gotten a status of forces agreement in Iraq if we'd really, really tried. Do you agree with that?
Actually, let me put it to you another way. I mean, if it goes through the Parliament, the problem was it was not probably going to be approved by the Parliament. An interesting fact is that I believe we now have 3,500 troops on the ground without a status of forces agreement. So we seem comfortable doing this now that we really have to. And candidly, that was something I think we might have considered trying, given that the Prime Minister was going to give his personal assurance and test it out. There's no guarantee that having 10,000 troops on the ground would have given us the influence or prevented Prime Minister Maliki from taking the highly sectarian actions that he did, but I would have liked to have tested the proposition.
Thank you for that. I'm encouraged that you're so positive about Prime Minister Abadi and his reforms and the fact that he has the backing of Iraqi citizens in the streets. I assume by that you mean Kurdish Iraqi citizens in the streets. Sunni.
No, I mean Shia Iraqi. If you look at the,
okay, well, what about
folks
the
haven't
Sunnis
picked
and the
up.
Kurds?
I don't think folks have picked up. Well, they very much want to see inclusive governance. The Sunnis desperately need it because without this, they have no source of revenue. So those who say let Iraq break up, by the way, it's one thing for the Kurdistan, which is largely autonomous, now actually has pretty good oil and revenues coming in, although not enough. They are running a deficit, and they still need what they can get, their 17% out of the oil revenues from Iraq proper, which means really the two southern provinces that produce the most. But there's no oil or gas revenue going to be provided for the Sunni areas. There's no production in those areas. So one of the really serious problems is how would they survive? The second is who draws the boundaries, where are the borders? I mean, if you have a state of politics that's so fractious that you have a population that's alienated, how in the world are you going to have an amicable divorce? This will be a very fractious divorce, and it'll be another civil war, perhaps, along the lines of Syria. So I have great concern about that. Abadi wants to pursue inclusive politics, but I don't think people have picked up that there are huge demonstrations going on in the cities of Iraq in the southern part of the country because of citizens who are outraged by insufficient services, particularly electricity during extraordinarily hot weather in recent weeks, really month, and then corruption. And they are just flat outraged. The Grand Ayatollah then, seeing this outrage through his clerics, issued statements that really encouraged the kinds of reforms that Prime Minister Abadi has now pursued, and they are now moving. Each week he has pursued more reforms, and indeed he knows that the only way to combat ISIL sustainably is to get the people in the area where ISIS is located to turn against them in the same way that we did with reconciliation with the Anbar Awakening with the Sons of Iraq program. But of course, citizens can't turn against a particularly barbaric force unless they have a sense that they're going to be secured. So this will have to proceed, but to do that, you have to have Sunni Arab Iraqis who will not only clear, but then be able to hold these forces with a considerable assistance from us in the form of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and precision strike assets.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand that this sort of divorce you talk about is something really to be avoided in Iraq, and you have a different view about Syria, where you seem to suggest in your testimony it wouldn't be the end of the world if Syria, as we've known it, does split up into 3 or 4.
Well, because they've had this horrific situation. I mean, Syria has gone through considerable, you can call it sectarian cleansing. I mean, you have had horrific sectarian displacement. I mean, this would not have been the solution for Syria 4 years ago, but we are where we are with Syria, and you see enormous displacement of different sects.
But we can avoid that in Iraq, and we should make every effort.
No guarantee we can at all. This is going to be a very close-run affair, but we should try to avoid it, I think. There will be greater devolution of power. There's going to have to be a different political bargain, if you will, between Baghdad and the Sunni Arab provinces. And by the way, one of the challenges on the Sunni Arab side is that the Moslawis don't agree with the Tikritis, who don't agree with the Anbaris. So you even have a fractious situation among the various Sunni leaders, by the way, all of whom come through here or see you somewhere out in the region. So that's going to be difficult as well. There is nothing easy about this situation right now, but I don't think we should just say, okay, well, let's just let it go further, because there are still mixed areas in Baghdad. There are still mixed areas in the Baghdad belts. Diyala province is still highly mixed. There have been efforts to reduce that amount of mixing. There has been sectarian displacement, indeed, in some cases, perhaps worse than that. But the only way to prevent that kind of horrific civil war breaking out, which is what the result will be if there is a determination to break it into Sunni, Shia, and Kurdistan, you've got to get inclusive politics. You once again have to give the Sunnis a sense that they have a stake in the success of the future Iraq rather than a stake in its failure. And that's what they came to feel back in 2006 before the surge, and it's what they have come to feel in the last couple of years as well.
Well, your answers are very thorough, and we're way out of time. Let me just ask for something on the record, because Senator McCain mentioned it in his opening statement. I would hope that on the record you can give us your insight as to what lessons we might apply in Afghanistan that we've learned from our experience in Iraq.
Chairman, could I make 2 quick points on Afghanistan, possibly? First of all, there have been reports recently that there was a policy or an acceptance of what clearly is absolutely reprehensible, unacceptable behavior by certain Afghans with using male, essentially sex slaves and so forth. I was very pleased to see General Campbell issue a statement today, the current commander in Afghanistan, who, by the way, was a 2-star in Afghanistan, as you'll recall, with the great 101st Airborne Division. When I was the commander of the International Security Assistance Force, he was also there as a brigade commander. And he stated very clearly that it has never been a policy, it is not a policy now, and it certainly was not something that was acceptable or even discussed, frankly, when I was the commander of the International Security Assistance Force. The very first line of the counterinsurgency guidance that I put out as COM-ISAF said, we have to be seen to be helping secure and serve the people, and we have to help the Afghan forces do the same. There's no way that kind of behavior would be seen as helping to serve the Afghan people, and it is absolutely unacceptable. Second, look, I do think that we have to take a very hard look at our future plans for the footprint that we have in Afghanistan, recognizing that now there is an Islamic State presence being established there, recognizing there still is work to be done to continue the disruption, the further disruption of al-Qaeda senior leadership in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. That campaign has had considerable progress, success indeed, not only Osama bin Laden, but over a certain period, 3 number 2s in about an 18-month period. And that is a very, very much diminished in capability central headquarters for al-Qaeda, but it has to continue to be disrupted because we don't own the ground, and really nor does Pakistan fully. Beyond that, we're at a situation where, with a relatively modest number of U.S. forces providing assistance to our Afghan partners, we are able to continue to accomplish the mission that we went to Afghanistan to achieve. And we cannot forget why we went there and why we stayed. It was because Afghanistan was where al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks and conducted the initial training for those attacks. And our mission was to ensure that never again would Afghanistan be a sanctuary for al-Qaeda or other transnational extremists to do that again. That mission has been accomplished so far, as you know, Senator. It is now being done with a relatively modest number of U.S. forces. There still are casualties, but way, way less for us. In the meantime, Afghan forces are very much fighting and dying for their country to help achieve the mission that is so important to us and to them, to not allow the force retake their country, the Taliban that did allow al-Qaeda to camp out on its soil and plan those attacks.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Chairman McCain, let me recognize Senator Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General, thank you and your family for your service to this country, and it is good to have you back here with us today, and we appreciate your ideas, your advice a great deal. One of the things I want to ask you about is you emphasize the need to work with the Kurds, Turkey, Israel, and other allies to interdict Iranian arms bound for extremist groups. We've had the authority to cut off these shipments. What are the challenges and what are your recommendations to help finish the job on this?
Well, the challenges have been that there has been fairly devious and difficult operational security carried out by Iran when it has provided weapons to different forces, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, whatever. We do have a unique situation with respect to Hamas now that is quite extraordinary, and that is that Egypt, for the first time, is cutting the tunnels and absolutely obliterating the tunnels that used to enable the basically free movement of goods, and including weapons and ammunition, from the Sinai into Gaza. That is no longer a reality, and that is a major development in that regard and a big help to us. Beyond that, I do think we make gains in a variety of different technologies and forms of intelligence, whether it's so-called maritime, big data, or a variety of other advances that can help us interdict that flow of maritime flow first, as it has, to some degree, limited the flow to the Houthis. We're, of course, in Yemen, where the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, other Gulf Cooperation Council countries are engaged in rolling back the action of the Iranian-supported Houthis, who, as I mentioned earlier, are trying to get at the point of a gun what they couldn't get at the negotiating table.
I see this as a critical part of the nuclear agreement that was just put together, is what you were talking about, the promise and the guarantee that we'll stand with them to push back on the conventional side from corner to corner here. And one of the areas is Lebanon as well, and Hezbollah. How do you feel we can be most effective in interdicting materiel, missiles, and others going to Hezbollah?
I think what we can most effectively do is assist our Israeli allies, frankly, with the provision of intelligence from a variety of different sources. And they have certainly not shrunk from taking action when there have been meaningful movements of military capabilities going from Syria to Lebanon, for example. The concerns that President Netanyahu discussed with President Putin yesterday, I believe it was, undoubtedly included a discussion of Israel saying we will continue to take action if hardware that matters moves from, say, Damascus into the Bekaa Valley into Lebanese Hezbollah.
I wanted to follow up with a question about Baghdad, where you say so much has to be determined. When we were in Iraq not too long ago, it was pretty clear that the Shia leadership in Baghdad was not creating any confidence with the Sunni leaders in the tribal belt out in Anbar and in other areas. And so how do we change that mix? I know supporting a body is critical, but how do we change the mix of so many of the Shia leaders who are tied to Iran so closely in getting some understanding in them that it's not going to work against ISIS unless we have our Sunni tribal leaders with us, and they're not going to be with us until they start to feel that the Shia leaders in Baghdad understand that, give them in effect a piece of ownership of the country.
Well, what's very, very important is that the elected prime minister of the country recognizes the criticality of inclusive politics. That is hugely important. It's also important to recognize that the people right now are quite supportive of the actions the prime minister is taking, because the people are outraged about the lack of basic services, the corruption.
He has a real window now, then.
He has a window. This is a very tenuous situation because, again, opposing him are the very forces that arguably saved Baghdad when the Islamic State was threatening it on the belts. And then these are the forces that some people are allied with. And they, by the way, at least a couple of these forces are led by individuals who were in detention during my time as the commander of the multinational force because of their involvement in the killing of our soldiers. They are now leading not only militias but parties in the parliament, to give you some sense of how challenging this is. So we're going to have to patiently, painstakingly, day after day, engage, use our convening authority, our support for the establishment of Iraqi security forces, not beholden to a particular political party with Iranian support and so forth. But this is going to be a close-run affair. Make no mistake about it. Prime Minister Abadi has crossed the Rubicon in the form of the reforms that he is pursuing. Keep in mind that when he did away with the vice presidencies, he did away with the jobs of the former Prime Minister of Iraq, Maliki, and other former Prime Minister Alawi, and the former Sunni Arab Speaker of the Parliament. These are considerable figures, and I think it was the right move, a very strong move, but he is going to have to be shored up in every way that is possible, not just by the United States, but by the coalition and, more importantly, by forces within Iraq that want to see their country move forward again as an inclusive country rather than one that practices exclusive politics that are carried out in many cases at the force of a gun. Keep in mind the outrageous activities that have taken place in Baghdad, where one of these militias just recently basically kidnapped, I think it was 18 or so Turkish workers, moved them all the way from Baghdad to Basra without being stopped, and is holding them ransom down there for some not particularly clear objective other than Turkey stopping the flow of ISIS into Iraq. There have been very, very public threats by some of the militias against serving leaders, including the Prime Minister. So this is a moment of real consequence, a moment of considerable drama in Baghdad. And I think we have missed how significant it is to see this number of Iraqi citizens in the streets expressing their outrage at what's going on in Baghdad, a Prime Minister who's moving to take action in response to that, but very powerful elements that are going to oppose him.
Thank you again for your service to the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Isn't it true that the major political influence is Iranian in Baghdad?
It is certainly a very important one. I have to think through what other one might possibly rival it, but I can't come up with one. But, you know, having said that, Chairman, as you know, Iraq has never wanted to be the 51st state of Iran, and they'll use that support like a crutch when it's required. The problem is that when that support gets tentacles into parties and so forth, it's very hard to get it back out.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General, for your service to this country, but also for being here today so that you can provide us with, I think, some very important insights. Our approach in Syria and Iraq seems to be that we're going to be relying on local partners to be the boots on the ground. Just how far do you think these local partners are going to be able to take us?
Well, again, they'll go as far as is in their interest to do so, which is why I mentioned earlier. We just have to be realistic about that. That is reality. That's why I mentioned earlier we should not think that the Kurdish Peshmerga, for example, can be pushed much farther below where it is that they are in Iraq right now, or frankly the Syrian Peshmerga. Again, you might get them a bit farther. You might employ them for some specific operations. They'll play a role in clearing parts of Mosul, one would think, but they can't ultimately hold those areas if they are predominantly Sunni Arab. So I think in that sense, we just have to be realistic. They have a stake, however, in doing generally what it is that we want done, which is to defeat the most extreme of extremists, the Islamic State, and then also, of course, ultimately to create a context within which Bashar al-Assad will be ushered from the scene in Syria, although it's difficult to tell, again, what ultimate shape Syria will have at that point.
General Dempsey speaks about patience and risk and weighing the patience needed and against how much risk we're looking at. How much patience should we be exhibiting towards our local partners in Iraq and Syria? How long should we stick with them before we reach a point where we've assumed too much risk and there may be no options left that the United States can look at? When do we reach that point, and is a tactical stalemate where we want to be?
Well, look, as I said, we are not where we should be. And the tactical stalemate is actually a fairly dynamic stalemate. This is not a stalemate that has one trenches and so forth. There's a lot of movement. We are rolling back ISIS in certain places, inflicting very heavy casualties on them. I would not want to be a leader in the Islamic State in Iraq or Syria. Because I think it would be very hard to get a life insurance policy if you were in those shoes. Having said that, there's a lot of reinforcements flowing in, and yes, we've pushed them out of this area or that area, and then they go into Ramadi, or in Syria they've sustained defeats around Kobani, and they go into lightly defended Palmyra. So again, this is still a lot of movement, and ISIS is on the defensive in certain areas without question, in many areas, but still has the freedom of action to exercise initiative, certainly in some places. The key with our partners is, of course, we should be impatient, we should push it as hard as we can, but as you know, this is one of those where you can't rush to failure, and that's unfortunately what can happen if we push it just too hard.
I believe in your opening you said that in the future, what will be our relationship to the Iranian power as we see this after the agreement, and that the United States used to be a counter to Iran, and now we may be looking at accommodating them. Can you tell me what you feel would be the challenges and if there are any opportunities to both of those positions? If we find ourselves as a counter, or if we find ourselves as being there just to accommodate Iran?
Yeah, and again, what I said was that there are concerns in the region that we might accommodate Iran, that we might work with them and now Russia
And certain
and
comments,
Bashar.
I
Now,
think, have challenged our credibility recently from the Secretary of State in Syria, for example, though, as well. So it goes to our credibility in the region, too, beyond
and
the
credibility matters.
Yes.
And I can tell you I was just out in Asia, Mr. Chairman, in Australia, and it's all about U.S. credibility and what does that mean for the South China Sea? Does what happened in Syria a few years ago have implications for that? The answer is yes, it does. At the end of the day, if Iran's foreign policy is continued to be dictated by the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force and enables proxies like Lebanese Hezbollah, a designated terrorist organization by the U.S., Hamas, another one, Houthis, again, with what they're doing, and murderous Shia militia in Iraq, then obviously we have to counter that malign activity. If, on the other hand, Iran changes spots, whatever, changes its approach and so forth, by all means, if the conditions change, then we should be always alert for opportunities to work with what used to be a former enemy. We've done this throughout our history. I think the chances of that are not particularly high, but it's not something one can rule out if something happens as a result, perhaps, of Iran being reintegrated into the global economy and deciding that it wants to be a responsible world citizen instead of trying to achieve regional hegemony.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Cutt.
General Petraeus, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for your many decades of distinguished service.
Thanks for your own service.
Our country. In your testimony, you've broken your main areas of focus down to Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and also you recognize the interrelated nature of them. I want to start with the section on Iran, where you emphasize that the nuclear deal, whatever its short-term implications for the nuclear program, cannot be seen as ushering in a new age of accommodation or conciliation of Iran's interests in the regions. Given what's happened in Syria over the last month with Russia entering the picture, how do you think that our Arab and Israeli partners in the region view our current posture towards Iran's influence in Syria?
Well, I think they're actually waiting to see right now, frankly. I think that's why I inserted the point. I talked to a number of those individuals and on a quite regular basis, and they have expressed concerns about the future. And they want to see us continue to counter malign activity by Iran if that continues, and we have to be very, very clear about that. Beyond that, I think, again, the very clear ironclad statement about what would happen if Iran moves towards weapons-grade uranium enrichment after the 15-year mark, or if they should do it before then, that has to be very clear as well. That would speak volumes.
You helpfully recommend in your testimony a few concrete suggestions for policy direction for each of Iraq, Syria, and Iran. There's one related to Iran. It says, quote, additional actions to demonstrate that the theater remains set with respect to our own capabilities to carry out military operations against Iran's nuclear program if necessary, end quote. Would you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Thanks, Senator. In fact, when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, we developed a plan that would attack Iran's nuclear program. It was quite thoroughly developed, rehearsed, and the theater was set. In other words, as a logistician, as Senator Ernst would appreciate, we had all the bed-down sites, we had munitions positioned, the fuel, everything is there so that if you need to conduct an attack like that on relatively short notice, you can do it. The theater has remained set by and large ever since. I think there's the possibility of adjustments now because some of the countries in the region, I think, would be more accommodating to basing than they were at that time, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia foremost among them. So again, I think it's time to very publicly lay out how we have postured our forces, again, not giving away major secrets here or something like that, but ensuring that the region knows and Iran knows that if need be, we can do what is necessary with our military forces.
What message does the absence of a United States Navy aircraft carrier group in the Persian Gulf send to Iran, Syria, and Russia on the one hand, and the Sunni Gulf states on the other hand?
It says that there are limits to U.S. military power. What I don't know is whether that means that there's none in not only the Arabian Gulf, but also in the Arabian Sea. In the past, we've actually had 2 out there, or at least a minimum of 1, although that one might sit off the coast, sort of south of Pakistan, flying its aircraft up into Afghanistan every day. And if there's none in either of those locations, again, that's a statement that there are distinct limits to what it is we're capable of doing, and therefore there are limits to what we can do to help the forces in the region.
Moving northward to Syria, you write in one of your proposals for Syria, we could, for example, tell Assad that the use of barrel bombs must end, and if they continue, we will stop the Syrian Air Force from flying. I suspect that he will not listen to us if we tell him that, so we must stop him if we want them to stop. Did you propose this policy to President Obama while you were in government?
Yeah, when Syria started, I was the director of the CIA, not in uniform anymore, and certainly didn't have any responsibility for military actions with respect to Syria.
Did you support that policy that others recommended?
I don't remember a recommendation of it. I don't remember barrel bombs at that time, frankly. Again, this is the very early stages where there was no Lebanese Hezbollah, there was no ISIS, there was no Jabhat al-Nusra, there was no Khorasan group, and there was no maybe limited Quds Force advisors on the ground.
And now there's Russia with surface-to-air missiles and fighter aircraft. Could you explain to us what exactly it would look like if we were to stop Assad from using these barrel bombs or to ground his aircraft, given the presence of Russia in such heavy numbers now?
Well, I think Russia would probably get a little bit of advanced warning once certain assets are in the air. This doesn't mean that you have to penetrate into the integrated air defense of what might be left of that integrated air defense of Syria. You can do this with, again, lots of different forms of cruise missiles coming off of ships, subs, and planes.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. On behalf of the chairman, let me recognize Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And General Petraeus, it's great to have you with us. This testimony has been quite helpful. So I'm going to just go into areas where I'm confused and I'm really interested in your opinion. We've had a lot of testimony before this committee really over the last year and a half. Most recently, General Austin's posture hearing in March of this year that talks about the instability we're seeing in the region as kind of a spiking of a long-standing Sunni-Shia divide that is at some points relatively calm and at other points, you know, pretty significant. And yet I've also heard others say that might overstate it. It could be more Arab v. Persian or you know, Revolutionary Guard v. monarchy, or it could be all of them together. But I just would like to ask your question, your opinion on this. Do you think the Sunni-Shia divide, kind of the sectarian divide, is widening, and is that a significant contributing factor to the challenges that we're seeing?
I think that there has been a widening of the sectarian divide. I think what you see in Syria is very much a sectarian civil war. But I'd also point out there are also ethnic overtones, because in Syria alone you have a Kurdish, Syrian Kurdish element that clearly wants and has now achieved a degree of greater autonomy. And you have, of course, the same in Iraq. And then, frankly, in some other countries, you have what might be more of a tribal or, say, an Islamist versus non-Islamist, as is the case in Libya with a real civil war, but largely between Sunni Arabs, or in Tunisia, which has been more of a political contest, where thankfully the 2 leaders of the major parties actually agreed to agree with each other, or at least not to be opposed to the bitter end, but actually reach some compromise.
To the extent that, so multiple factors, and that's my sense too from my more limited experience, but to the extent that some of the instability is caused by a widening sectarian divide, would you agree that it is pretty important that the United States not unwittingly sort of plant our feet on one side or the other of a sectarian divide. Sunni versus Shia is not the U.S.'s issue, and we do need to be careful and just kind of be mindful of not giving the impression that we're taking a side in a sectarian divide.
No, I think that is accurate, and I think all we have to do, if people say, well, you're on the side of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries or all Sunni Arab, we would then merely point out, of course, that we have supported the Shia Arabs in Iraq, and if it were not for our action, Sunni Arabs would still be ruling the country.
Right, indeed.
A Shia majority country by far.
Indeed. Another strategic challenge, it seems like the areas where we've done best in the battle against ISIL are the areas where we've worked in close cooperation with the Kurds. I was with Senator Donnelly at the Joint Operations Command in Erbil in July, I guess, and then some of the activities of the U.S. and Kurds working together in northern Syria have had some success. But sadly, no success doesn't create some of its own challenges. And on the Syrian side, it just struck me as odd that after a long time of trying to get Turkey more engaged in the battle against ISIL, it was when we started to do a lot of work together with the Kurds around Kobani and elsewhere and achieved some success that Turkey then decided, okay, now is time we want to really participate in this. And then there's obviously been tension between Turkey and some of the very elements that Kurdish elements in northern Syria that are having some success against ISIL. I'd be interested in your kind of thoughts on the Turkish role here and how we maintain that NATO alliance with Turkey and get them involved in the battle against ISIL without them cutting the legs out from under the Kurds who have been effective partners.
I mean, Turkey's been an ally for decades, very, very important country in the defense, first against the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, and continues to play a very important role. And I think it's very significant that, again, General Allen and others did great work to get access to Incirlik Air Base and to get pledges by Turkey to certainly to make the movement of ISIL through their country into Syria much more difficult. But clearly there are historic tensions between Turkey and their Kurdish population. Very sadly, very tragically, there is now much greater violence as a ceasefire, and there are various explanations as to why this has happened and whether the blame lies in the capital of Turkey or out with the Kurds themselves. But this is another complicating factor, without question. And I think we saw that the Kurdish regional government of Iraq, which was starting to think that Turkey would be very, very supportive as they were exporting oil through Turkey and so forth, when they tried to reinforce Kobani with Kurdish Peshmerga from Iraq, found it very difficult to move that until the U.S. again offered its convening authority and brought people together and helped push that through. So there's some historic tensions there as well. And so again, the bottom line is you very, very rightly identified there are sectarian divides that are very, very important, probably arguably the most important, unless you're caught in the middle of an ethnic divide. Between, say, Arab and Kurd or Arab and Persian, when that's the most important. And then there's also a tribal overlay and even an Islamist versus non-Islamist in countries like, again, Libya, Tunisia, and frankly in Egypt for that matter.
Great. General, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
On behalf of the Chairman, let me recognize Senator Rounds.
Thank you, sir. General Petraeus, thank you very much for your service to our country. Over the last year or so, Prime Minister of Israel has come before us and explained and expressed his concern with regard to the what I would call the nuclear concession agreement, which our administration has proposed. King Abdullah of Jordan has been before us and has requested, as he said, first of all, on the day that it was announced that one of his pilots had been incinerated, he said thank you for the F-16s, but he says it would be very appropriate if we could also receive some of the armaments which we had been waiting on as a country for literally 24 months. Thank you. And then in the spring of this year, Saudi Arabia, along with a coalition of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Jordan, Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, and UAE, When they began their campaign in support of, or at least in their attempt to make headway in Yemen, we found out about it as a nation after it had occurred. Seems to me that that does not suggest in any one of those occasions a deep degree of cooperation and trust with those traditional partners that we have. You mentioned the need for coalition maintenance. Could you give us your assessment on what needs to be done right now to perhaps begin the process of building and maintaining that coalition that we've been relying on in the Middle East for years?
Sure. And some of the elements, of course, were in my opening statement where I talked about, again, first and foremost, reassuring them that Iran will never be allowed to enrich to weapons grade, then approving requests for various weapons systems that have taken a long time to be approved and wouldn't seem to threaten any of the balances about which we are concerned. That's particularly interesting now that there is a convergence of interest between Israel and the Gulf states, as an example. The integration of different military capabilities of the countries themselves, take ballistic missile defense, early warning systems, and so forth. Again, this is something we have been pushing. Secretary Carter has encouraged us, Commander, Central Command. Again, there's more we can do in those areas as well. Again, this really comes down to a question of whether we'll be there when they need us most. There's no question there have been strains. There's no question that some of the episodes in recent years have generated some concern. We have to be careful not to overdo it because there's an insatiable desire for certain, the requests never stop. But I think we do have to reassure these countries, and I've laid out some ways in the opening statement, I think, on how we should go about that.
I'd like to go back to one of those thoughts, and that was that you indicated we should make it crystal clear that we would not allow uranium enrichment to occur with regard to the Iranians' activities.
To weapons grade.
To weapons grade.
Right.
Do you think that's missing in the, or one of the items which was missing in the arrangement or the proposal that the administration has brought forward?
I think we can make it more clear, and frankly, if Congress and the White House were to do it together, if this was, seen as ironclad. Again, remember that, of course, it's not members of this Congress or this White House that are going to be around 15 years from now. It'll be their successors. But establishing a U.S. policy that becomes, again, very, very foundational, I think would be a very important move. The President did, in a letter to one of your House of Representatives, Congressman Nadler, laid this out, but then there was a little qualification later on. So again, this is a time just to be absolutely clear, straightforward, and I think that opportunity is there.
I agree with you. I wish it would have been included in the proposal that we saw. Finally, with regard to reconciliation, I just noted one item when we talk about building and trying to find those coalitions and so forth. I just wanted to a clarification, and that is with regard to ISIS. Do you see any reconciliation ever available with those who we now term as ISIS?
Certainly not with any of their leaders, middle leaders, or probably the bulk of the rank and file. I mean, this is such an extremist organization that it is probably beyond redemption. I wouldn't rule out the possibility of a few misguided souls that want to come back to the fold. A fair amount was made that I said that we should deal with Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. I really didn't say anything of the sort. What I did say is we should try to strip away from within. Jabhat al-Nusra has had a number of groups that probably would have been classified as moderate Sunni Arab elements drift to it because it had resources and they did not, and because it, probably more importantly, is actually fighting against Bashar al-Assad, and the forces that we were supporting had to accept that they would not do that as a condition of our providing them weapons and training. And I do think that there's a possibility that there might be some sub-elements and certainly some fighters that could be wooed back to the cause of the. We did this, it was not popular throughout the ranks in Iraq in February 2007 when I said that we are going to have to sit down with people who have our blood on their hands, al-Qaeda, Iraq, and associated insurgent groups. That did not mean that we sat down with the leaders of Iraq, of al-Qaeda, Iraq. We tried to kill or capture them, same with the major insurgent groups. It did mean that there were a number of individuals, though, below that with whom we did deal. And did bring them in. Ultimately, you know, there were 103,000 or so sons of Iraq, of which about 80,000 or so were Sunni Arab. And by the way, there were Shia Arab sons of Iraq as well, ones that wanted to shed their ties with the militia, particularly after the militia were defeated.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Ono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General, for being here today. The Middle East is an area that is very complicated, and there's a lot of instability there, to say the least. So how would you rank the most destabilizing forces in the Middle East if you were to look at Assad, ISIL, Iran, and its malign activities in the region, al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, they're all sources of enormous instability and really, again, problems that extend beyond the region.
So would you be able to rank them?
I don't think I can, no. And, you know, on a given day, we might be more concerned with the plot by the Islamic State, which might actually do enormous damage in Europe to one of our allies, or perhaps even inspire something in the United States. On another day, it might be the actions of Iran in providing lethal munitions to Hamas to rain indirect fire objects on Israel.
General, in the 10 years that you were that you served in the Middle East, then has it always been thus there? It could have been the Taliban. You know, there was always just a whole range of entities who created tremendous instability in that area. Has it always been that way in the Middle East?
Oh, no, I think the instability in the Middle East is much greater now than it was, say, when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command from 2008 through 2010. I mean, for one thing, we've had the Arab Spring, so it's not just a result of extremist elements, Bashar al-Assad or Iran. It is the throwing over of longtime dictators who did achieve a degree of stability in their countries, but obviously at such great expense that ultimately the people rejected them. So I think that's probably the single biggest cause of the instability. And what you see then is groups like the Islamic State, and indeed to some degree, Iran and others that are taking advantage of ungoverned or inadequately governed spaces. I think one of the lessons of the post-Arab Spring is that if an area is ungoverned or inadequately governed, extremists may well seek opportunities in those locations.
Well, hence your caution about Assad, and if he were to be toppled, then who would come in to take his place? There are some who have said that we ought to support the partitioning of Iraq, turning to Iraq so that the Kurds, the Shia, the Sunnis would have their areas. And I believe you said today that that would be a bad idea. Did you say that?
I did.
And do you see any kind of scenario where partitioning Iraq in some way would actually lead to some level of stability and allowing that country to go forward?
It's a wonderful question. I have no intellectual objection to the concept of a Shia-stan, Sunni-stan in Kurdistan. I have never had anyone explain adequately to me, though, how you get to particularly the Sunni-stan and the Shia-stan. Who is it that draws the boundaries? What happens in terms of oil revenue for Sunnistan, which has no oil production in the footprint that it now occupies? So again, there's very serious practical issues here, which if not resolved, result in a civil war, and you'll have Syria Part 2, except in Iraq. So again, intellectually, academically, okay, but tell me how you're going to get there. In a country in which the politics are so fractious that the Sunni Arabs feel alienated from Baghdad, they're not going to agree. This is not going to be an amicable divorce. This will be a civil war. Tragically, there has been further sectarian displacement during the latest violence, as there was, in fact, in the 2005-2006 timeframe to a considerable degree. But they're certainly by no means divided. And again, the concept for how the Sunnis would survive, how they'd generate revenue, how all of this would work, I think are quite problematic.
So would you say that any kind of movement toward that kind of partitioning should come from within? It certainly shouldn't be imposed upon them from inside.
Very, very good point. Indeed,
we have not had much luck doing things that way.
Well, I mean, the boundaries were drawn by outsiders, and
yes.
You see them be obliterated now to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think you have raised a very, very important point, and that is that whatever the future is, it's going to have to be agreed upon, or it's going to be fought over.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I did have one more question. If I'm running out of time, but would you mind?
Actually, you've run out, but please go ahead.
Thank you. Over the weekend, the U.S. began military-to-military talks with Russia following the arrival of additional Russian military equipment, including tanks and fighters already in aircraft in Syria. And I just wondered, what would your primary objectives be if you were holding these talks with Russia?
Make sure that nothing goes bump in the night. You know, that there's not an operation carried out by either side that is misconstrued by the other, is misinterpreted, and ends up in shooting where there doesn't need to be shooting.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I mean, same as we actually have ship-to-ship conversations with Iranians. We had ship-to-ship conversations with Chinese in the counter-piracy mission off Somalia. Actually, we had ship-to-ship with Iranian ships that were actually helping with the counter-piracy mission.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Petraeus, I apologize for having to step out. I've been to a committee meeting, 2 meetings, and a vote since then. But I was here to listen to your opening statements, and I have to agree with the chair. I think you did an extraordinary job in kind of setting the stage for the discussion and some of the concerns we should have in the region. I did want to go back, and I do apologize if others ask you to expand on this. If you did, just let me know, and I'll go back to the record. But when you were talking about proposing enclaves as potential safe havens within Syria, could you give me an idea of what that would look like, over what reasonable time frame could we do it? To what extent could that potentially have a positive impact on the refugee situation in the region? Just give me a little bit better idea of how that would play out.
Yeah, I don't think I can give you a timeline. I mean, it's going to start with us actually making a declaration that the barrel bombs are going to stop and that we're going to defend what's ever in that enclave.
And what statement or what strategic positions are we taking to end the barrel bombing? What precisely would the U.S. military and potentially coalition partners be doing to make sure that that just ceases?
Well, you have a policy decision and a policy statement that says the barrel bombs stop, and if they don't, your Air Force stops flying. Our military can figure out how to stop the Bashar's Air Force from flying.
I have another question.
Could I, on the enclave, Senator, the enclave is hugely important when it comes to refugees. I mean, what's happening is the refugees are just giving up. And so they are very much, they would want to go back, I think, still now, if there's any hope. And an enclave gives them hope. Without that, over time, you're just going to see a continued exodus, and it is already overwhelming, obviously, borders and countries in Europe.
Now, once you create an enclave, it could, on the one hand, be a safe haven, on the other hand, be a huge target. So then, how do we, we've attempted to train the Free Syrian Army as a potential. The original thought was not to put them in an offensive posture, but to put them in some sort of defensive posture so they themselves could create, I guess, enclaves around the areas that they maybe came from, and that's not working. But how do we then make sure that we have the presence on the ground to ensure the security of these so that they would be perceived as a safe haven in the region versus the mass exodus that we're seeing now?
Well, first, again, there's a policy decision that says we're going to protect you against all enemies, not just against the Islamic State. And I think if they understand that, and if you put a sufficient constellation of assets over them, that you could do a reasonably good job with that and equip them with some radios and other communications devices so that we can be alerted if they're experiencing pressure. Again, I don't want to make light of this. This is very complicated military activity, but it is doable. And at a certain point, I'm not, at all against having some of our forces in an enclave.
And I think you said in an advise and assist role.
That's right.
That's right. I have shifting to a different direction. Iran. Last week, the president doubled down on his position to not allow petroleum exports from the United States, while at the same time the Iran deal was going to allow Iran to export oil. I think some estimates after the sanctions are lifted as many as 1 million barrels a day. It's my understanding they need a price point of about $130 a barrel for them to really start balancing their books.
No, I don't think so at all, Senator. Not Iran.
So you think it's lower than that?
Oh, I think it's a good bit lower than that.
I may have my facts wrong, but just conceptually.
I mean, they wouldn't sell the extra 1 million barrels. Again, you're saying
let me finish
for their budget? I think they're okay.
Well, let me finish the thought process, though. Based on your military and intelligence experience, do you believe that the United States, being able to also participate in the global markets and being able to export oil and other energy products to other nations who may become dependent on Iran, at the same time that Iran is benefiting economically from it, is also a strategic weapon that we should be looking at?
Look, this is not just based on my military intelligence. I'm the chairman of the KKR Global Institute, and I'm a partner in KKR, one of the global investment firms, big private equity firms in our country. And first of all, by the way, the analysis on crude oil exports shows that not only would the price of WTI, West Texas Intermediate, go up slightly, so the producers would be better off, it would actually have an impact on Brent crude prices, which would come down the global price, which is a lot of what we refine, and the price at the pump probably would go down. So it's a very interesting, if you look at, I think it's the CBO that did the analysis of this. One of our analytical organizations here, I think on Capitol Hill, has looked at this, and it's a very interesting dynamic.
In general,
beyond that, I don't think we should get involved in markets as a country unless we want to do something like sanctions. So again, you wouldn't do it, if you want to use sanctions or economic tools as a weapon, fine. But otherwise, I think you have to be very careful about intervention in global markets.
Mr. Chair, I apologize. I'll be brief. The 130 number, I think, was the kind of profit they would have to throw off to also fix their fiscal problems versus the actually market price. But the other question,
or maybe to do investment in the fields in the future. There's something there.
That's what I was referring to. But I guess finally, I want to make sure I understand the answer to your question. Do you believe that the United States being able to extract more energy from the regions under our jurisdiction and provide that energy is a part of a strategic play to hedge against Iran's ability to go out, make more money, fund more malign activities, do more of the bad things they're already doing?
Look, we ought to produce all the oil and gas that we can if we're making a profit. If we can enable countries like Iraq to revive their oil industry as we did, it helps Iraq, it funds their government. By the way, they're running a fiscal deficit now. But again, this is really about market forces, I think, much more than getting involved in this as a country. The fact is that the energy markets right now, because of the U.S. shale gale, the oil energy revolution so far most significant with crude oil in the global markets. And next, by the way, the next big disruption is going to be in the liquefied natural gas markets because of the approval now of whatever it is, 6 or 7 LNG plants for the United States. There'll be, and that's going to be a huge challenge for President Putin. And as I mentioned earlier, Putin's hand is getting weaker. He's running enormous deficits. He's carrying out very costly adventures outside his country. He's got a limited amount of foreign reserves left to fund this, and he doesn't have access to the global markets because of the sanctions on him and on the many of his major banks. So I think he's got problems down the road. And oh, by the way, when our LNG hits European markets, just as Australian LNG is hitting Asian markets, you're going to see a compression of natural gas prices even though he's selling it off the pipeline and we'll have had to liquefy, ship, and regasify.
Senator Shaheen.
General Petraeus, thank you for being here and for your insights into what's happening in the Middle East. I know last week General Austin was here, and he got questioned by a number of members of this committee about the train and equip mission. And unfortunately, what he had to say about that mission suggests to me, and I think to others on the committee, that it has not accomplished what it was supposed to. And my recollection is that you advocated for a similar kind of mission early, before it actually started. And I wonder if you have thoughts about what can be done at this point. I think as it has been operating, it has not been successful. So what should we be doing? Is there any way to right it? Should we just abandon it and go on to other areas?
First of all, you can't abandon it, because anything we want to accomplish in Syria has to be enabled by a Sunni Arab force on the ground, whether it's the defeat of the Islamic State or creating a context within which the Bashar al-Assad regime might be willing to go to the negotiating table, or stemming the flow, the exodus of refugees from Syria that is overflowing European countries.
So
I think the central issue is that we have to pledge and then take action to support these fighters against anybody who comes at them, whether it's ISIS, which we want them to fight, or Bashar al-Assad or Jabhat al-Nusra, or even other elements. So again, we're going to have to support them against all of these. They want to fight Bashar. We've at least got to enable them to fight Bashar's forces in a local way, without, as I mentioned in my statement, creating the conditions where Bashar goes before we have a sense of what it is that we want to see follow him, or what will follow him.
Thank you. In your testimony, you talked about establishing enclaves in Syria that would be protected, which I interpreted as what's normally described as safe zones. Is that what you were suggesting by the enclaves you were talking about?
Safe havens, I think.
I had a
and by the way, they could be in the south as well as the north. I mean, and actually there's a reasonable one in the south, I think, arguably contiguous to Jordan.
Well, last week we heard at the Foreign Relations Committee from Michael Powers of Mercy Corps, which has done a lot of work, humanitarian work in Syria. And he expressed grave concerns about establishing safe zones. He suggested that it would be very difficult to keep them actually safe without a lot of investment of additional air power and troops. He also thought they could become a target for extremists, and that they could be used by some countries as an excuse to reject refugees. So how does your proposal suggest we address those issues?
Well, we're going to defend it. I mean, you have to make what he's saying, you just can't declare something a safe zone and expect everybody to honor that. We would have to, again, this is the key. The forces that we support aren't going to stay supportable. They won't even stay alive, as we have seen, if we don't take very active measures, have a credible campaign for them to pursue. And part of that campaign should be establishing enclaves. I don't really like the word safe zones. There's nothing safe about a safe zone unless you're going to defend it. And the people on the ground will judge whether or not you're doing that, and they'll vote with their feet, whether they're willing to stay or even come back or depart with a number of the others. So we would have to invest in supporting that zone. It doesn't mean I don't think that you have to have our boots on the ground in that enclave, although, again, at some point, security is adequate. I would be comfortable doing that, just as we were comfortable doing it in Iraq.
Finally, one of the things that I think we have not done as successfully as we need to is to counter the ISIL propaganda. And do you have thoughts about how we could be better responding?
This is a really, really difficult problem because of the magnitude of it, the sheer number, the way that machines are used to amplify, to magnify. I think we've got to get smarter about that. I've talked to people at Google Ideas, for example, about various techniques that could be used on our side in the same way that they're used on their side. We did have a program at CENTCOM during part of the time that I was the commander where we had what we termed credible voices. These were native speakers, sometimes dialect speakers, with academic training in various religious disciplines and so forth. And they were quite effective. The problem is that it's very costly. And again, whether that effect is really measurable is something that could be debated. So I think we do have to partner more effectively with those that really understand the technology, and then we have to activate those who are willing to engage in this. I don't know that it can by any means be all government. I just don't think we can generate the critical mass that would be sufficient for this task.
My time is up, but should it be spearheaded by CENTCOM or by State Department or coordinated?
The problem with it being spearheaded by State Department can be best explained by an episode when I was the CENTCOM commander and the Undersecretary of State, high-ranking government official, came to CENTCOM to ask, I think, for $1 or $2 million from us, which we provided somehow to help them with their program. So it's State Department has never been adequately funded. I don't know if Senator Graham is here. He's the subcommittee chair, I think, still of the key committee and has generally agreed with that. But we have always called for state and AID to do more and more and more. And yet we have not given them the appropriations, nor in some cases the authorization to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral McCain. General Petraeus, thank you for appearing in front of the committee today. And I think you can see from the attendance at this committee today that your opinions and your thoughts are very highly valued. So thank you for sharing with us today your thoughts. I would like to go back to the Kurds a little bit. I think we've talked a lot about it, and everybody's asked questions, but maybe not in all manners. So the Kurds have been a great ally to us, and I've heard that from many of the men and women that have served in that region. They've been a great partner for 25 years or so. And they have a healthy respect for the rule of law. They've been very helpful with a number of minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. And what can we do to better provide support for the Kurdish regional government, the Kurdish Peshmerga? I believe we need to double down in this effort, regardless of whether they may push beyond their regional boundaries, but they do provide an area, whether we can engage them in shaping operations, whether it is to provide an area for us to base. Can you give us some thoughts, the advantages and risks?
I can. The fact is we are based there, as you know. We have headquarters. We have operational headquarters. We have very close relationships in both my military and intel lives. We were very, very closely linked. I think the single biggest issues are the provision of weapons and other supplies to streamline that. You know, I've said we have to support Prime Minister Abadi. We need to strengthen him. That means we can't bypass him on these issues, but we need to figure out how to get this so that ideally it doesn't have to touch down in Baghdad. It can go directly to them. Some coalition members are doing that, I think actually with our tacit approval, if not applause. I think that's the single biggest step that we could take, and to look very carefully at what it is we're providing them. There are some additional items. Again, I happened to be there for a conference in Suleimaniya back in the earlier part of this year and had a lot of people come and plead that particular case. The other is to determine, you know, the KRG, the Kurdish Regional Government, is in very, very difficult financial times right now because of the price of oil going down by 55%. It's not only reduced what they get, but it's reduced the amount from which the 17% that they get from the central government is. And so they're having a very difficult time. They're supporting hundreds of thousands of refugees on their soil. Anybody who goes up there and flies over this will see a camp every few kilometers. And indeed, they're fighting a war. And again, if we could provide additional assistance to them that would be of support, I think that would be very valuable also. We have very much enabled them. We helped them hold off. Had it not been for decisive action, actually, at a critical moment last year, it's very possible that the Islamic State might have gotten closer to the capital of Erbil. That held that off and then has really retaken most of the area around the Kurdish regional government. And candidly, there are no more disputed internal boundary areas in Iraq. They are generally controlled by the Kurdish regional government as a result of the operations that have taken place with our support.
Very good. I appreciate those thoughts very much. I would tend to agree. I would love to see more assistance going to the KRG, of course, in consultation with the Iraqi government. I applaud you on that as well. If we could turn to Turkey just very briefly. We've talked a little bit about the fact that they have mobilized, and unfortunately what we have seen is that through their mobilization of resources, whether it's political, military, instead of really pushing back against ISIS, we see there's been a turn to mobilize against PKK. And what do you see the impact is to those coalition forces, the anti-ISIS coalition forces, and what are the greater implications of that and thoughts maybe from some of those coalition members?
I don't know that this has a huge effect on U.S. or coalition forces. They're not being diverted to assist. There's a certain slight degree of support that we have provided in the past in the intelligence realm that I don't imagine has changed a great deal. What I think is very significant is what's happening within Turkey as a result of this. The sheer escalation of the violence, a situation that was relatively calm and seemed to be heading toward one in which there was greater and greater reconciliation between the government in Ankara and the sizable part of their population in Turkey that is Kurdish, with the allowance of meeting certain desires of that Kurdish population. And all of a sudden, the wheels have come off the bus. And whether this is connected with a future election in Turkey or something else, it is very distressing to see because, again, the violence on both sides now has escalated very, very rapidly and quite considerably.
Great. Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, General. Thank you, Admiral.
General, first, courage is an element of character, and courage to admit mistakes, particularly in an open forum such as you did at the beginning of your testimony today, to me is a huge indicator of character, which I think is the essential quality of leadership. And I want to compliment and acknowledge that you did something that wasn't easy this morning, and it's very meaningful. Question about Russia and Syria. The recent buildup of Russian troops, of course, is very worrisome. On the other hand, Russia was, you should pardon the expression, an ally when it came to getting rid of the chemical weapons. Is there a geopolitical opportunity where Russia may recognize the danger of ISIS to them, to Chechnya, to that ideology, and there could be common cause with them, not to dump Assad precipitously, but to work on a negotiated agreement where Assad would be moved aside, because Assad is ISIS's evil twin. He brought them into being.
Exactly, and continues to inspire the recruiting, and it's a magnetic attraction.
Exactly. So talk to me about the possibility of talks with the Russians, seeing, I believe countries act in their interests. And in this case, they have an interest in not seeing ISIS metamorphose into terrorism in their country. Is there an opportunity here for working in concert with the Russians to move Assad aside, perhaps guaranteeing their presence? You mentioned the bases on the Mediterranean.
This is not something I'd rule out at all, Senator. I think, again, there's no question they have an interest. They're worried about the effect in the Caucasus There are Chechens that are down fighting without question in Syria. There's a worry, of course, they'll go back presumably and be more effective. So the problem is if they had wanted to have done this, if that was really their goal in life, they could have contacted the coalition of more than 60 countries and said, where could you bed down our aircraft? How can you integrate us into the air tasking order? We'd like to drop bombs on ISIS just like you guys.
It appears that these recent moves, they've simply said, we're going to shore up Assad no matter what.
Well, it's really, again, you're right. This is about national interest. And their national interest is to preserve the naval base that they have at Tartus, down on the coast, and then Latakia, the air base.
Perhaps there's a way to assure that without necessarily guaranteeing the presence of Assad.
There could be at some point. Again, if there are serious negotiations. It's not the kind of thing that you would just rule out unequivocally. This is a real complicator right now, though, and if they really enter the fight on the side of Assad, rather than just sort of protecting, again, this coastal enclave that matters to them strategically, geostrategically, then we're going to see real complications. And ultimately, you could end up, you don't want to be in direct conflict. You know, look, Russia is an important power. It has carried out very provocative actions. It doesn't mean that we need to be provocative in return, but we do need to be firm in return. We do need to establish what is unacceptable, actions, Ukraine as an example, and we have to do that here, but we've got to see this develop a bit further, recognizing again that there is a very clear way for them if they just wanted to attack ISIS, and that would be to join the coalition.
Changing the subject, you talked about barrel bombs and air power. Is there an alternative? And I'm very aware of the problems, but an alternative of providing closely vetted Syrian opposition with man-pads or similar weapons which could neutralize Assad's air force without mobilizing a major air war and coordinated strikes and essentially escalating the conflict. In other words, you can take care of barrel bombers from the ground or from the air.
This has been an issue in virtually any of these kinds of endeavors we have been engaged in.
Since Afghanistan.
Exactly. And the concern, of course, is that one gets out of hands and drifts over somewhere else and takes down a civil airliner. And so the risk in this has to be very, very carefully measured and mitigated. There are some techniques, some technologies, some other things that can be employed. I'm not sure that we have not done that or that other countries have not done that. But it's a very risky proposition, and we have to exercise enormous caution if we employ that.
And those mitigation factors would be crucial. Final question. Do people wake up in Iraq and think of themselves as Iraqis or as Sunnis and Shias or as Kurds?
Sadly, I think in recent times it is more their sectarian or ethnic identity rather than Iraqi. Having said that, I remember when the Iraqi soccer team won the, I think it was the Asia Cup, and that night there were cheers all the way from Basra through Baghdad to Erbil. So there can be unifying features. And let's never forget, the most important centripetal force in Iraq is still there, and that is the distribution of the oil revenues by the central government to the provinces, the ministries, and so forth, including the Kurdish regional government.
Thank you. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General, good to see you again. I also want to echo what Senator King said about your comments earlier. Very much appreciate you being here and what you did, what you've done for the country. I wanted to just talk a little bit. I know there's been a lot written on the surge and what you did and what the chairman and others did with regard to that important strategy. To me, it's an example of where you have a strategy, you have rhetoric, and then you actually have action. And what I mean by rhetoric is the President and others announced what we were going to do, and then we took action. And I think one of the broader strategic failures right now that certainly we're seeing with all the chaos in the world is that we, in many ways, as a country at the high levels, whether it's the President or the Secretary of Defense or others, we're talking about things, red lines in Syria, Bashar, al-Assad's got to go. Even Secretary Carter gave what I thought was a very powerful speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue when we were out there.
Right.
On the built-up islands in the South China Sea, but none of these statements have been followed up by action, unlike what you did with the surge. What happens when, as a country, we talk a lot but don't act?
Well, first of all, I think we have taken action, and I have to be somebody who sits here and says that
Where have we, on those three examples?
We killed Osama bin Laden?
No, I gave 3 examples.
Well, no, but I was merely going to say that this is not a record of unmitigated lack of action. But in my statement, I said that inaction, in some cases, inaction has consequences. And I think that is the case with some of the cases that we're dealing with in Syria, without question.
So what do you think happens when we don't take action?
Well, if you do not act, others may. Others will question. Again, you know, the art of this is figuring out when to take action and, of course, what action to take. This is not an argument that you should always take action everywhere all the time. As I said, you take action, solve all the problems.
Should you take action if you're actually, what I'm talking about is not just random action. I'm talking about action to implement stated policies that you've already announced as a country. Are you hearing in your travels throughout the world that the United States is losing credibility in terms of our national security and foreign policy?
Look, there are some questions out there. And what I was going to do is point out where there have been actions, because this is not, again, a record of no action. There have been some very, very courageous actions. I took very tough issues to this president, and he took action. There have also been some on which there was not action. And if those in which there's not action taken really matter, then obviously, again, there are consequences. They accumulate. I do think that the Syrian red line that was not a red line, which had a decent outcome in the end, as was pointed out, you know, 90% or so of the chemical weapons gone, but the way we got to that was quite a circuitous path, and to be bailed out by President Putin at the end of the day was, again, a very interesting outcome. That is not the kind of case, I don't think, that instills, you know, and again, a great sense of confidence in the United States.
Let me ask another in terms of actions. You know, in another area of the world, in the Arctic, we're seeing a lot of strategic interest from the Russians and other nations for reasons of natural resources, transportation routes, and you've seen a really pretty dramatic, aggressive move by the Russians in terms of a new Arctic military command, 4 new BCTs there, 40 icebreakers, a lot of heated rhetoric there. And then in terms of the U.S. action, if we were to remove our substantial Arctic forces, say the only airborne BCT in the entire Arctic or Asia Pacific, what do you think that would do in terms of additional Russian reactions in that part of the world?
I have expertise in a reasonable number of places in the world, but I'll defer to you on the Arctic, I'm afraid.
Okay, let me ask one final question, General. You know, I think there's a bit of a strategic irony going on where some of us think that in certain parts of the world we're withdrawing, and yet when you look at, and you and I have talked about the instruments of American power, not only the military, but things like energy that we've talked about, the ability in terms of finance, the ability, resurgence of manufacturing in the United States, best universities in the world by far. I mean, the list, agriculture, the list is very, very strong, where we have so many advantages over other countries, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, long-term advantages. How do we utilize those in a way that show that we still are the country holding all the cards and on so many different instruments of power that countries measure power by?
Well, first of all, we don't own all the cards, but rumors of America's demise have been greatly exaggerated, to paraphrase Mark Twain. I teach a course
called The Coming North American Decades at the Honors College of the City University of New York. I've just done a monograph at Harvard as a fellow, again, on the great new emerging economy, North America. When I was asked a year or so ago in London after the American century what, and I think they expected me to say the Asian century or the Chinese century, I said the North American decades. And the bottom line is that our economy is fundamentally, it's got lots of challenges and there's a lot of issues that we need to resolve, some with the help of this body working together with the other body. All that notwithstanding, at a time when the #2 economy is slowing down quite significantly, we don't yet see the rise of India. The Eurozone has got a very differentiated recovery. The U.S. has continued. We may be in the longest recovery in our history. It has not achieved escape velocity. There's aspects of it, again, that are not great. But when you look at the rest of the world and when you look at the fundamentals of the United States, whether it's demography compared to the others, whether it is the values that we share with our two neighbors. I mean, you don't see Mexico asking China to pivot to North America to help them balance against the United States the way every country that has a maritime boundary with China is doing to us. So there are enormous strengths here in this country. You enumerated a number of them. I've laid them out elsewhere. There are a number of actions that this body, again, could take to address issues that are really headwinds to us capitalizing on this tremendous opportunity because of the energy revolution foremost, but also the IT revolution, which enables all the others, the manufacturing revolution that's now beginning to gather steam, and the life sciences revolution, which is starting to gather momentum as well. We are the leaders or among the leaders in every one of these areas, and we have a number of really great, again, fundamentals here that are going to keep this country and North America writ large in a very enviable position. I would not want to be in any other economy than this one right here. And I now get paid to analyze those kinds of factors and elements.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
General, thank you very much for a lifetime of extraordinary service under difficult circumstances.
And thanks to you for yours. As I noted in a response to a local newspaper article here, you served 9 stints under my command in Iraq, CENTCOM, and Afghanistan alone. Each of those is a week or a bit longer. I was very skeptical before the first one. I didn't appreciate the great opportunity we were going to have.
We can understand the
skepticism. Yes, and under duress, I accepted Colonel Lindsey Graham of the Judge Advocate General Corps of the U.S. Air Force Reserve. And I must say that after every single one of those visits, you came back and provided a real nugget in one of these big ideas that helped us come to grips with one of the serious issues we were confronting, starting with issues that we had at Camp Bucca, as you'll recall, in Iraq, and carrying all the way through various legal conundrums that we had with President Karzai in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you. You've certainly made my day, and it was a very small contribution. And
I am nonpartisan, by the way, Mr. Chairman. I really, honestly.
But I really appreciate that. The bottom line is I enjoyed the heck out of it, and I learned a lot under your command and working with people in the region. So let's try to see if we can make some sense out of the world as it is. There's 2 things going on at once, I think, in the Mideast. A fight for the heart and soul of Islam and a demand for social justice, particularly by young people and women. Do you agree with that?
Certainly among the 2 biggest issues. I don't know if I'd put some economic issues that might be in the social justice category, but that would be another element.
The only reason I mention this, I just want the American people to understand that young people are not going to live in dictatorships for our convenience any longer. Do you agree with that?
They're not doing it for our convenience to begin with, but I think what the real point here is that the age of the dictators is certainly under a certain degree of strain, and we've seen it boil over in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, some degree Yemen.
Well, would you agree that America should take sides in this struggle and side with young people and say, yes, you're right to demand a larger voice about your children if you're a mother. You're right to want more economic opportunity. We should say, we should embrace what they're asking for.
Yeah, I don't know that I would do this as a universal declaration, but I would certainly have that in the back of my mind as I looked at each and every case.
Well, I'm going to do it as a universal declaration. That's just me, though. Now, on the other side of Islam, there's a. Do you agree with me that most Muslims reject radical Islam?
Yes. Yeah.
And that is, to suggest otherwise, you really don't understand the region. That the biggest victim of radical Islam is other people in the faith.
It's generally Muslims.
Yeah, and you have been there more than anyone I know. Don't you agree with me that the good news for all of us is that we can partner with people within the faith who are willing to partner with us and destroy this radical ideology, and it's going to require these partnerships.
Correct. And I mean, we have sought to do that. We have done that. We
So
do
when
it
people say
in our
they're
own
all
country.
the same, they don't know what they're talking about. You have seen
I'm a
thousands.
Presbyterian. I don't think all Presbyterians are the same either, frankly. So.
Good, good. Nor do I, General. But the point I'm trying to make for people to look at the Mideast is everybody's the same, everybody is radical. They miss the boat. Most fathers and mothers don't want to give their daughters to ISIL.
Correct.
So that is something we need to build upon. In terms of Iraq, the President has said the goal is to degrade and destroy ISIL. That is the right goal. Do you agree?
Destroy is a very high bar in the military lexicon, and I think it's actually been lowered slightly to defeat, which I think is adequate.
Okay.
I'd love to destroy him as well. We did destroy al-Qaeda in Iraq, I think it's safe to say.
You certainly did.
And sadly, they were able to resurrect themselves in the form of ISIS and then gain strength in Syria and come back into Iraq.
Absolutely. Now, but do you believe more American ground forces would help lead to the defeat of ISIL in Iraq?
What I've laid out here today is indeed a requirement for additional forces, not ground combat forces, additional advisors at brigade headquarters level, probably augmentation. What's going to happen is, you know, you will get a critical mass at some point of Sunni forces, and it will set off a chain reaction, as we did when we had the Anbar awakening, where it rippled up and down the Euphrates River. Then ultimately it goes up the Tigris. We have to be prepared to capitalize on that, and I suspect we'll have more training locations, more locations where we'll have advisors in assistance.
Right. But would a couple of aviation battalions help, Army aviation battalions?
It would help. You're going to incur greater risk, obviously.
Definitely.
And you're now getting into this in a way. We have obviously attack helicopters, which we have employed.
Right.
Now you're starting to add numbers quite considerably, and I'd be concerned about possible ramifications of that.
And I'm over, but I do want to talk about Syria. Is there anyone left to train in Syria that would have the capability to both destroy ISIL and push Assad out? Is there an indigenous force left to train?
I think there are forces that if we pledge to support them against everybody, not just fight the Islamic State, and start off by actually allowing them to solidify control over an enclave before we launch them or push them into an offensive.
What about a regional force? Would you support the creation of a regional force with two goals in mind, to destroy ISIL and push Assad out?
I'd have concerns about that. I think that to have neighbors go into one of the countries in this region, again, every country is different, but to go into a country that is as already fractured as is Syria, I think there are some complications with that.
Finally, Assad should go. He must go.
He has to go ultimately, but the key word there is ultimately underscored in bold letters, because until we have a sense of what will replace him, we need to be very careful not to push him out, because what comes after could actually be even worse.
How many people do you think are left that would be willing to fight both ISIL and Assad, and how long would it take to train this indigenous force? And would you have American boots on the ground as part of that training?
I'd put them certainly in the ground first in Turkey and Jordan. I'd certainly be willing to put them into an enclave when it's solidified, secure, and you're not going to put people in jeopardy of ending up in an orange jumpsuit in a cage.
Right. But how long do you think it'll take?
I don't, Senator. Again, you give me the assumptions, and I could give you a timeline. But again, there's a host of assumptions that we'd have to make before we could get any precision on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
General, on behalf of Chairman McCain, let me thank you for your extraordinary testimony, insightful and thought-provoking, as always, and also for your incredible service to the country. And one thing that always impressed me about you is that your dedication to the men and women you led was unshakable, and everything you did was about those young soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator.
The hearing is adjourned.
So let's take a picture. Everybody wake again. Good morning. So maybe in this row here. Yeah. Yes. We can make it, I think. You want to go to the row? Yeah, all of you. I'm not tall. Or to the side. Or to the side. What am I doing? Great song. Everybody is great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. I can see that. Yeah. Now, okay.
And just watching some of the players here on the floor still saying their goodbyes, talking with some of the people who attended this hearing. If you missed any of it, you can...
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.